I am Ashley Batts Allen, Associate Dean of Faculty and Research in the College of Arts and Sciences at UNC Pembroke. I study self-compassion and its impact on trauma, and it is an honor to welcome you to UNCP's 6th Annual Human Trafficking Conference. There are over 300 people registered for this conference, so I want to thank you all for your sincere interest in learning about this terrible crime. As a university community, we take prevention of the crime of human trafficking very seriously. And this year, our conference will highlight the intersection of trafficking with Indigenous communities and cultures, especially Native American tribes, as well as Pacific Islanders from Guam and Micronesia. As you will hear from Dr. Lawrence Locklear in a few minutes, UNC Pembroke was the first state college established specifically for American Indians. And our original mission of creating opportunities for Indigenous populations is still central to our role in this region. In addition, UNCP is an active advocate for Native peoples. Therefore, the realization that human trafficking is disproportionately affecting Indigenous communities at a higher rate is particularly concerning. This year's presenters represent several Native American tribes as well as Pacific Islanders. These women work tirelessly to fight against human trafficking in various parts of the United States. We are honored to welcome to our conference today the keynote speaker, Lynette Gray Bull, a member of the Northern Arapaho tribe and the Standing Rock Sioux tribe. Jeannie Hovland, a member of the Flandreau Santee Sioux, Nikki Locklear and Reza Jones, who are from the Lumbee tribe, and Mary Kate Soliva of Chamorro descent, and Cynthia Cabot, who is Guamanian. We are honored again to have Bill Wolf with us, the 2018 recipient of the Presidential Award for Extraordinary Efforts to Combat Trafficking in Persons, who will be here again to speak about his work on a presidential task force titled Operation Lady Justice, which addresses missing and murdered Native American women and girls. Since 2015, this conference has brought in a wide variety of experts to our university to keep our students and the public aware of the dangers of human trafficking. Our university has been honored to hear from experts such as members of Congress, state legislators, and members of law enforcement agencies, including the FBI, Homeland Security Investigations, the Wilmington Police Department, the New Hanover County Sheriff's Office, and the North Carolina State Bureau of Investigation. In addition, we've heard from assistant district attorneys, members of non-governmental organizations who work to support and aid survivors, members of academia, members of the NC Human Trafficking Commission and the NC Coalition Against Human Trafficking. But most importantly, we've heard from survivors of human trafficking whose contribution to fighting this crime has been the greatest resource.
Hold on, Lisa, let me turn this down.
It is my pleasure now to introduce you to the organizer of this conference and a true
Hey, how are you?
Human trafficking survivors, Judy Paparik.
Good morning, everybody. Could you mute yourselves?
I'm not. It's a webinar and it goes to 12. It just started.
Good morning. Good morning, everybody. Could you mute yourself?
For some reason, this computer does not like WebEx.
Hey, Dr. Paparosi, make me co-host.
I muted Melissa. Got it.
Right-click on my name and just make me co-host, and I'll help you with some of that as well.
Thank you, sir. It just says make presenter. Is that okay?
I don't think I can do it as a presenter, but go ahead and we'll get it after you're finished. Sorry.
Okay, so welcome to our 6th annual Human Trafficking Conference here at UNC Pembroke, our 6th since 2015. Of course, we had COVID, and this is our 2nd virtual conference, and it really has changed the game because we have people from all over the country listening today, which we're really excited about. And of course, Dr. Allen mentioned, thank you so much, Dr. Allen. She mentioned that this year's theme, because our school is concentrating on Indigenous cultures and communities as a graduation requirement, which we're so thrilled about, and a wonderful idea. And so this year, with the intersection of human trafficking with Indigenous cultures and communities, and originally we focused on Native Americans because Bill Wolf, who teaches me everything about human traffic over these last many years. But then we were so pleased that we were able to be in contact with Pacific Islanders, specifically Cynthia Cabot and Mary Kate Soliva. So we've been blessed. So we're really getting the full gamut of what's going on. So we're going to begin our conference this year by learning a little bit just about UNC Pembroke and its history as North Carolina's only historically American Indian university, which we're really proud of. Dr. Allen already kind of introduced the speakers, so I will just jump to say thank you all of you for doing this. I know we're in all different time zones and it's a little crazy. We have as far out as Guam, which is like 11 o'clock at night here on the East Coast. But I always want to give a little plug to how you can do something about human trafficking. I don't want you to come here and just hear the problems. There are some really, and they're actually simple solutions that I love to share with everyone. And there's two major forms of human trafficking, as I'm sure you all know. Sex trafficking is a big issue in our country. Now, we may not be able to solve that all over the world, but in our own country, just monitor your children, the young siblings in your life while they're on their computers and the phones. Don't be afraid to parent your children, because every time your child is online, she's online with 750,000 criminals, if you can believe it. That's a statistic from the FBI. So don't hesitate to look at their cell phones, to have a parent guard on your cell phone if they're your children or your younger siblings. Just really take it, because the traffickers are out there, especially their weapon of choice is this, the cell phone. This is the weapon of choice. So if your kids are on your cell phone, like, by the way, our kids go on their cell phone an average of 262 times a day. Now, we may be up there in the hundreds, but they've got the number one. And the traffickers are right there looking for your kids. So monitor your kids is one of the best things you can do. And the second thing, when it comes to labor trafficking, we are all affected by labor trafficking just by what we buy. Our diamond rings, our chocolate, which is harvested by childhood slaves. And a very simple thing, two things you can do. One, you can buy fair trade. This is Kilwin's ice cream. They didn't even know they were doing fair trade. I went in, I went, fair trade, that's wonderful. Which means everything in this chocolate bar, not Hershey's, not a lot of the big companies have not done this yet, but Kilwin's has done it. It now has fair trade chocolate, which means the cacao or the cocoa is fair trade, as well as the sugar, and every ingredient is not harvested by slaves. We have millions and millions of slaves, and a big percentage is children. And if they're doing this, so you can have a taste of a Hershey candy bar or something like that, not insulting Hershey, but the Hershey organization knows it hasn't done it yet. But there's endangered species, and what you'll look for is that little fair traffic, I can't get too fair trade mark. There's Honest Iced Tea, which is also fair trade. There's Zevia iced tea, which is also fair trade. And a real quick way of finding if what is fair trade is downloading this, sorry, somebody just texted me, this Department of Labor Sweat and Toil app. You go shopping, you put in the type of thing that you want to buy, say bananas, you pull up bananas, and it'll tell you when you buy your bananas, what countries use child or adult slave labor. So they're quick and easy ways just to be able to be part of the fight against human trafficking and not just hearing about the problem. So that's my preventative talk that I try to give every year. And now we're going to move on to Dr. Locklear, Dr. Lawrence Locklear, who works at UNC Pembroke in the Office of Student Inclusion and Diversity. He's an adjunct professor here as well, associate professor in the Department of Indian Studies at UNC Pembroke. We're so proud to have him. He's a first-generation college student. He has his Bachelor in Arts in American Indian Studies and his Master of Public Administration from our university at UNCP, but he earned his PhD in Educational Studies with a concentration in higher education and a minor in Educational Research Methods from UNC Greensboro, another one of our proud universities. His dissertation actually examined the engagement of undergraduate Lumbee students, commuter students, at a Native American serving non-tribal institution. He is a citizen of the Lumbee tribe here in North Carolina, which we're so proud to have so many friends in the Lumbee tribe. It's just the most wonderful group of people. His research interests include the Lumbee and American Indian history and culture, Indians in American higher education, and the history of our wonderful university at UNC Pembroke. He co-authored a book, Hail to UNCP, 125-year history of the University of North Carolina at Pembroke, with two other professors, Dr. Linda Oxendine and the late Dr. David Alitis, I think I said his name right. And he appeared on the History Channel in it called Aftershock, Beyond the Civil War. He provided historical commentary on a Lumbee hero named Henry Berry Lowry. He has held numerous leadership, I'd be all here all day talking about this, within the American Indian community. He's a brother of 5 Sigma Nu, which is the oldest and largest American Indian fraternity in the United States, where he currently serves as chief counsel on its executive board and the chief president. And he also served as the chief president. Are you still the chief president, Dr. Locklear?
Yes, I am.
Okay, so he's still the chief president, the national president. He also co-chaired our 125th anniversary at our university. He served as a vice chair for American Indian Women of Proud Nation as the Lumbee Tribes representative for its board for the United Tribes of North Carolina. He's an elected representative in the past of the Lumbee Tribal Council. He served 2 years as its speaker. And there's awards and awards and awards. Outstanding Student Support Award in 2021, Pembroke's Award for American Indian Heritage Center, Phi Gamma News, Phi Sigma News 2016 New Man of the Year for professional chapters, and the co-recipient of UNCP's Chancellor's Award of Excellence in 2013. And he also got a newspaper award, but I'd rather give him the time. Please welcome Dr. Lawrence Locklear.
So thank you, Dr. Paparosi, for that generous introduction. So I'm really excited to talk with everyone today and share a little bit about the history of UNC Pembroke. I need to apologize for the way I sound. I've been fighting sinuses all week. So, Pollengeddon is not helping anything here in the southeastern United States. So those of you who live here understand. So, but I'm going to take a few minutes and share with you a little bit about the history of UNC Pembroke and how it transformed from an institution that was established to serve American Indian institutions to one of the constituent institutions of the University of North Carolina. So, Dr. Paparosi, if I could get access to share, or you can make me a co-host or presenter.
James is here to help. James.
Okay. I'll share my
Make him presenter because I'm not co-host yet. So just right click on his name and then click presenter. Make presenter.
Thank you, James.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that. Okay. All right, so we'll go ahead and get started. I hope everyone can see this okay. So during today's discussion, I'm going to start off with UNCP's land acknowledgement, and then I'm going to talk with you real shortly about UNCP today, our relationship with the Lumbee tribe, and then briefly discuss the establishment of the institution as Croatan Normal School, and then talk about how the institution evolved over the years. And during all that, I'm going to mention some notable events, people, and traditions of the university. So UNC Pembroke, and I'm going to read the screen to you. Sorry, it's really long, but UNC Pembroke, North Carolina is home to 8 federally or state recognized tribes. Those include the Kahari, Eastern Band of Cherokee, Halawa Saponi, Lumbee, Maharan, Occaneechi Band of the Saponi Nation, Saponi, and Waccamaw Siouan. UNC Pembroke respectfully acknowledges that the lands within and surrounding present-day Robeson County are the traditional homelands and gathering places of many indigenous peoples, notably the Lumbee. So we share an ongoing responsibility to safeguard these lands and to respect the sovereignty of the Lumbee tribe of North Carolina. UNC Pembroke honors all indigenous elders, past, present, and emerging, who have been and remain an integral part of the history and the culture of this region. And the reason why I share this is it's important to understand that UNC Pembroke was established for American Indian people, notably the Lumbee, but it's also situated in the heart of the Lumbee tribe in Pembroke, North Carolina. So every day that a student comes to our campus, they are coming into our tribal community. So it's important to acknowledge the land on which this university sits. But the institution has a close relationship with the Lumbee tribe. The Lumbee people, we take our name from the main waterway that runs through the region, and that's the Lumbee River. The Lumbee people, the tribe is comprised of at least 55,000 members. Our ancestral homelands are considered are Robeson, Scotland, Hoke, and Cumberland counties in southeastern North Carolina. The town of Pembroke, where UNCP is located, is actually the cultural, political, and economic heart of the Lumbee tribe. And so to tell you a little bit about UNCP today, before I get into the history, I want to share a little bit about who we are as a university today. We do have a unique and historical mission of service to the Lumbee tribe. In 2005, we were designated North Carolina's historically American Indian University. And best I can tell, we're the only institution in the United States that has such a designation. Our current student enrollment is about 7,600 students. Our classes are really small. There's a 20 student to 1 faculty member ratio. We offer 41 undergraduate programs and 18 graduate programs. Our students are very engaged on campus and also very service-minded. We have a number of nationally recognized faculty. Our athletic programs compete in the NCAA Division II, and we've done really well in those.
Do you want to meet? What's
Also, our student body is known as one of the most diverse in the United States. In fact, U.S. News and World Report ranks us as among the most ethnically diverse universities in the southeastern United States. And so one of the other major drawing points to our university outside of the diversity of our student body is its affordability. We've always been one of the most affordable institutions in North Carolina. And then in 2018, the state of North Carolina created the NC Promise program. And what that means is that institutions that are designated an NC Promise campus, in-state tuition for students is $500 a semester. And so we are designated NC Promise campus, and in 2018, our enrollment increased dramatically because of that designation. So we're really excited about that. And so when we talk about UNC Pembroke and its founding, let's go back to the 1880s. To tell you a little bit about U.S. history, the U.S. Civil War ended in 1865, and then Reconstruction ended in the 1877. Soon afterwards, there was the implementation of Jim Crow segregation in the United States. And by that time, Lumbee people believed that having an educational system that we controlled was very important, because it would mean one very important thing, that we would be able to maintain the survival of the Lumbee community as a very distinct community. But also having an educational system we controlled would provide better choices for our children. And so in 1885, Lumbee leaders collaborated with our local representative in the North Carolina House of Representatives to introduce legislation that provided state recognition to the tribe here in North Carolina, but also established separate Indian schools that, more importantly, were administered by Indian school committees, and that committee was given the authority to select teachers of their own choice. So in 1885, we were able to manage our own schools and select our own teachers, because before that time, the state only provided a formal education for white and black students. So in 1885, Indians here in Robinson County had a chance to educate students on their own terms. Well, the schools got started, and Indians began to realize that with our own Indian schools, it would be great to have Indian teachers to teach in that school system. And so they also, in 1887, the same leaders reached out to our representative in the House, and he again introduced legislation to establish a normal school that would train Lumbee people to teach in that school system. So on March 7th, 1887, Croatan Normal School was established. So let me tell you a little bit about the name Croatan Normal School. A normal school was a teacher training institution, and normal schools were common throughout the United States. In 1885, when the Lumbee received state recognition as an Indian tribe, we were given the name Croatan by the state. And the reason for that was the representative who introduced legislation to recognize the tribe had developed a theory. It was his theory that we were descendants of John White's Lost Colony and coastal American Indians who had intermarried and migrated inland and settled in Robinson County. As I tell folks, the issue with that theory is that there was no oral history or material culture here to support it, but because he was in a position of influence, we were given the name Croatan. So that's why when our institution opened or was established in 1887, we were known as Croatan Normal School. And so the institution's main purpose when it was founded was to train Lumbee teachers. Two of the requirements for attending the school were that you had to be at least 15 years of age, and you must teach at least 1 year in the Indian schools. The state did appropriate $500, but that $500 had to be used solely for the salary of the first teacher. So when you see this photo of the original building, the land that the building sat on, the material that it was constructed out of, and the labor that went into constructing that building had to be provided by the Indian community. So as a result of that, the institution instituted its first fundraising efforts. And so monies were raised, the land was purchased, the building was constructed, and the institution opened in the spring of 1888. And when it did, there was one teacher with 15 students. And the school was also located 1.5 miles west of where we're at today. And one thing that's really interesting about the institution is that when it was established, The first board of trustees were all American Indian men. They were all members of the Lumbee tribe with the exception of W.O. Moore. W.O. Moore was a member of the Waccamaw community. And one thing that's unique about him is that he received normal school training to be a teacher at an African-American school in the 1870s. And so he relocated to Robeson County in the 1870s and married into the Lumbee community. And when the institution started, he was selected as the very first teacher in the school because obviously he had received normal school training and was a teacher. These other men were very influential in the community. They had the political, cultural, and financial capital to support the institution, but also they knew how to build relationships with whites in the community so that we would have support from the white community. The other thing that's unique about these gentlemen is that many of our students, faculty, staff, and alumni have blood connections to them. Isaac Brayboy is my great-great-great-grandfather. And so it's pretty common today to find, again, students, faculty, staff, and alumni who descend from these gentlemen. So we still have a blood connection to the founders of this institution. So the school started in 1888. Things went okay the first couple of decades. It was pretty tough because this was a farming community, and most students actually spent probably between March and October working the farm field. So many only had access to an education for a couple months out of the year. But things did settle down, and by 1906, 1907, the administration wanted to add a girls' dormitory and dining hall to the campus. The problem with that is there was no land to add that at the Pates campus where the school was originally constructed. So land was purchased in the town of Pembroke, and in 1909, the school moved to Pembroke. And the reason why the school wasn't originally constructed in Pembroke was because the town of Pembroke didn't exist at that time. UNCP is actually 8 years older than the town of Pembroke. But by 1909, the town had grown and there was a train depot and businesses. So there were a number of benefits to moving to the town of Pembroke in 1909. So once we did move, the photo on the right, the building that's at the right of that photo was the very first building on our campus, and it sat where Oxon 9 Science Building is at today, for those of you who may be familiar with campus. There was also on the left side of that photo, the girls' dormitory and the dining hall, and then in the middle was Old Main, which was constructed in 1923. And Old Main today is our most historic and iconic building on campus. Now, when we talk about our institution, one thing that's important to understand is how the institution evolved over time, particularly the curriculum. When the school opened in 1888, the coursework was at the elementary school level. Now, some people may say, why was it at the elementary level? Well, the reason being was, you got to think about it. Our sole purpose was to train Lumbee people to be teachers. And in 1887, you only had to have a 7th grade education to be a teacher in the state of North Carolina. So that's why it's easy to understand why the coursework was at elementary school level. Now, over time, the requirements to be a teacher in the state changed. And so by 1912, we were offering a high school degree and then a high school diploma. And then in the 1920s, we started offering our first college courses and offering a 2-year normal degree. A 2-year normal degree was the equivalent of associate's degree today. By 1933, we added a 2-year college degree, and that was for folks who wanted a 2-year degree but didn't want to teach. By 1939, we were finally offering a Bachelor of Arts degree, and you'll see the class of 40, they were the first to graduate with a bachelor's degree. And then by the late 1970s, we offered our first graduate program. So you can see how the curriculum slowly evolved at the institution, particularly in response to the state requirements to be a teacher. And so for many of our Indian students, many of them faced limited college opportunities, particularly in higher education. Jim Crow segregation limited higher education opportunities in North Carolina for Indians. And as a result of that, between 1939 and 1953, we were the only state-supported 4-year college for Indians in all of the United States. And so some of our Indian students were able to attend other institutions, but for many of them, they were only able to do that because they were able to pass. And what I mean by passing is they were able to pass as white. One of those was Weta Lowry. She graduated from high school here in 1934, attended Appalachian State University in the summer of 1934, and then that fall transferred to East Carolina University. Things were going really well for her until she had a chance encounter with a student from Robeson County. The student went back and told her that there was this Indian student enrolled at this all-white institution. The parent of that child reached out to the president and told the president, if you don't disenroll that Indian student, I will withdraw my child. So discussion went on between the president of the institution and the UNC system. The system office wanted to kick Wida out, but the president of ECU allowed her to finish classes that semester. She transferred out to Middle Tennessee State University, where she graduated in 1937. In Tennessee, Lowry is a common name, and also many folks in Tennessee have never heard of the Lumbee, so folks had no reason to question Wida, particularly when it came to her racial identity. Right. I want to talk now briefly, just real shortly, about some of our campus traditions and development of our athletic programs. And the reason I mention athletic programs is you need to understand that for many Indians who were athletes in high school, our institution was the only place for them to be able to continue their athletic careers. And so they were able to come to Pembroke and play basketball, baseball, and eventually football. By 1944, our school colors were black and gold, and so those are pretty prominent today on campus. In 1946, we did institute a football team. We only had this team for 5 years because for two reasons. One, football was expensive, and two, we had a hard time finding opponents to play because we were still an all-Indian institution in the segregated South. But that fall, faculty and staff decided select a nickname for our athletic teams that was reflective of our student body. So that fall, they voted and they chose the term Braves. And so our athletic teams have been known as the Braves since 1946 because to faculty and staff at that time, it described the makeup of our student body. Now, our institution was all Indian at one point in time, but it was eventually integrated. And the interesting thing is that our institution began integration before Brown versus Board of Education in 1954. We started this process out of a need to maintain the institution. During the 1940s, we were always having to justify to the state why we needed a separate institution for American Indians. It's particularly when it was a very small institution. We only had about 100 to 125 students. So in the 1950s, the administration recognized the need to open the enrollment to non-Indian students. And so in 1952, Reverend Christian White became the first non-Indian student to enroll here. He transferred to Pembroke in 1952 and graduated in 1954, interestingly enough, a few weeks after the Brown versus Board of Education decision. Now, our first African-American students, though, didn't enroll until the late 1960s. And I think the main reason for that is that when you look at Brown versus Board and the integration of schools, Robeson County schools didn't fully integrate until the early 1970s. And so the university was closely tied to the public schools here. And so because of that, I think that's why our first African-American students didn't enroll at that time. But the thing that's interesting is that when Christian, Larry, and Sylvia enrolled, they all talked about the great experience they had at UNCP and how supportive the institution was. And so because of their experiences, you began to really see the institution diversify really quickly in terms of our student enrollment. So our campus began to grow. In fact, in the late 50s, Dr. Watergill came along and our enrollment grew from 151 students in 1956 to 758 in 1962. So this growth was very rapid. And then in 1962, Dr. English Jones became president. He was the first Lumbee to serve as president and then chancellor of the institution. And our enrollment grew from 758 to 2,300 students by 1979. In 1972, we joined the UNC system. And what that meant was that in 1972, all the public four-year institutions joined the University of North Carolina system. For us, it meant that we would finally be funded at very similar levels to the historically white and historically black institutions in North Carolina. In the early 90s, we adopted a new mascot, the red-tailed hawk, and our first official athletic logo. Now, the reason I'm talking about an athletic logo is because this logo, not only does it represent our athletic teams, but also illustrates the relationship between the community and the campus. Native peoples teach that animals serve as spirit guides and helpers to humans. And so when you look at our athletic logo, it illustrates that relationship between the red-tailed hawk and the brave. The red-tailed hawk is here to help the brave out and to make sure the brave succeeds. And so I tell faculty and staff that we take on the role of the red-tailed hawk, and it's our job to make sure that our students who are the braves are successful and then they graduate. So this athletic logo, like I said, represents our athletic teams, but also our relationship with the campus, with the community. In 1999, we were designated, UNCP was designated a focused growth institution by the UNC system. And so our enrollment went from 2,900 to 6,900 students in about 10 years. So we saw a tremendous amount of growth at that time. And so to wrap things up, I just want to talk real shortly just about the impact of UNC Pembroke on the Lumbee and the southeastern region of North Carolina. So UNCP does continue its historical mission of service to the Lumbee and other American Indians. We are a federally designated Native American serving non-tribal institution. 12% of our 12% of our enrollment is American Indian students, and that puts us in the top 10 nationally in terms of Native student enrollment. We have a Department of American Indian Studies that offers a bachelor's, minor, and concentration in American Indian Studies. We're the only institution in the state of North Carolina and the southeastern United States that offers that. We do have an endowed professorship in American Indian Studies. We also have a few other offices and programs that support our students. That includes the Kurt and Catherine Locklear American Indian Heritage Center, the Museum of the Southeast American Indian, which tells the story of Southeastern Native peoples. We also have the Southeast American Indian Studies program. And one thing that's really unique about our institution is that 13 of our campus buildings are named for American Indians. And it's pretty rare that you find any buildings on a college campus named for an American Indian, but we have 13 here at Pembroke. And so the university, one way that it did impact the local community, the Lumbee community, was it did create a Lumbee middle class. Lumbee people were farmers, and so when the university was established, that meant that we no longer had to rely on farming as a way to make a living, because farming was unpredictable. So Lumbees can now become teachers, have secure income, retirement, and benefits. But also it allowed Lumbees to continue their education. And for Southeastern North Carolina, it meant improved access to higher education for all residents of the region. And so with this last slide, I just want to share with you briefly some of our notable alumni. Tom Oxenine, who graduated in 1948, was the very first American Indian to be a pilot in the United States Navy, and he graduated from UNCP. For those of you who are fans of Cracker Barrel, Jack Lowry, who is a member of the class of '58, was part of the team that established Cracker Barrel. He was also their general counsel for 30 years. Jerry Lanier is a retired ambassador to Africa. Dr. Sally McCroy is the former provost at Florida State University. For those of you following the NCAA tournament, particularly the men's side, Kelvin Sampson is the head men's basketball coach at the University of Houston. They're in the Sweet 16. He's a graduate of the class of graduate in 1978. Brigadier General Alan Jameson is a great example of our braves who went on to distinguished careers in the military. And Pardon Nunaluu is our first brave to compete in the Olympics. He ran in the men's marathon in the 2016 Olympics. And so thank you for this opportunity to really share a little bit of the history of UNC Pembroke. I could spend hours on hours talking about our great institution, but UNCP is a very unique institution that has a historical mission of service to American Indians, but today serves a very diverse student body that comes from across the South, across North Carolina and southeastern United States. So thank you again for this opportunity.
Oh, Dr. Locklear, that was awesome, and just made me even prouder to work at UNC Pembroke. I'm just so proud of it. So our first honored guests are talking to us from Utah and Guam. I will share their screen as soon as Dr. Locklear pulls his down. We're going to be talking to Cynthia Cabot and Mary Kate Saliva. And Cynthia serves as the executive director for the Guam Coalition Against Sexual Assault and Family Violence for the Guam Coalition. She's been in that job since 2010. She previously served as a project manager, providing grants administration with local programs on Guam. She served over 30 years in public and private agencies, doing grants management, contracts administration, and she's facilitated island-wide and statewide projects in Hawaii and Guam. She's all over the Pacific with over 25 years of work experience in the field of health, social services, focusing on youth and families, program development, community organizing. And through the Guam Coalition that she's in charge of, she's engaged partners throughout the Pacific, including college campuses to address campus policies regarding sexual assault and prevention programming, and coordinated training for community health centers and domestic violence and human trafficking service providers. She has her, I'm very jealous of this, Cynthia. You have your BA in Bio and Masters of Public Administration from the University of Hawaii at Manoa, so I'm very jealous. And she's Guamanian. Guamanian or Guamanian? Guamanian. And we're so pleased to have her. And she's going to tag team today with Mary Kate. Mary Kate, are you here? There you are. Good. Mary Kate is a Pacific Islander of Chamorro and European descent. She's getting her doctorate in our field, criminal justice at St. Leo University. She co-founded the Guam Human Rights Initiative, which focuses on research addressing human rights issues. She is currently a Hoover Institution Veteran Fellow in the inaugural Veteran Fellowship Program under the direction of Dr. Condoleezza Rice, very impressive, where she focuses on human trafficking from a national security perspective. She's been in the military for many years. She's a veteran of the U.S. Army, has conducted numerous trainings for civilian and military audiences on human trafficking. I'm so thrilled to hear this. She has her BS and Masters of Public Administration from the University of Guam, where she led a forum on human trafficking in Guam and the Mariana Islands. And as a U.S. Army veteran and a veteran fellow with the Hoover Institution, she also sees human trafficking for what it is. It's a national security issue, and she has readiness concern for the military, and many military members are also a target for traffickers, as well as military institutions, which we've seen. And she says, again, with the big influence that Guam has in the strategic location for the U.S. military, we're looking at it from both the human rights angle, which is perfect, but also as a national security issue as well. She held a conference on Guam last September, and it was supported by Dr. Condoleezza Rice and other stakeholders. So welcome, Cynthia and Mary Kate, and I'll share your screen in 1 second. As soon as I find it, I'll make sure I have it. Just give me 1 second. It's not
Thank you so much, Judy. Hafade.
Thank you.
Hello, everybody.
Go ahead. I'll share your screen in a second.
I have to say what an honor it is to be here, and we are so grateful that you allowed us to represent. I know, especially with this conference, it's also about representing other Indigenous populations as well. So we're grateful that you invited us to be able to speak about the Chamorro Indigenous populations of Guam and the Marianas. And I'm so honored to also co-present with Cynthia, who I used to work for many years ago when I was a young whippersnapper, as I say, still very fresh and new in this space. And so it's wonderful to be with my dear mentor. So we are going to be talking about human trafficking in Guam, especially with our limited time today. And you can see from this picture here, this was actually painted by Chamorro artist Sarah Donnell, but it's called We've Met, to just note that you never know if you've probably seen or come across a victim, but you may not recognize that they are a victim. And so that's why conferences like these are so important for us to educate ourselves on the signs. And so this was a powerful painting, that image that we showed at the conference last year that you mentioned, Judy. So thank you.
You're welcome.
Next slide, please. Perfect. So I thought with our time to start with, where is Guam? So it is a U.S. territory in the Pacific, and we are Americans, but we are unable to vote for the president. So we have non-voting seat in Congress, but we're approximately the size of San Francisco Bay, or as Cynthia says, we fit snugly there if you want to do size comparison. And you can see that we're very close to Southeast Asia. So we're sort of the closest U.S. territory to Southeast Asia, if you want, as a reference point. We are not very close to Hawaii, as some people think. We are the largest and most populated of the Mariana Islands, which it also includes like Saipan, Tinian, and Rota. But Guam is the largest populated with, I believe it's around 160,000 people at this time. And Chamorros are the indigenous people there. But as I mentioned, don't forget about Saipan, Tinian, and Rhoda when you also talk about Chamorros. Thank you. Next slide, please.
It's not going.
Great. So we do just a brief overview, because as Cynthia and I know, we could go very deep into the colonization piece, but I think this part is really important, as seen in other indigenous populations as well. Colonization is something that's seen throughout history, and our colonization actually started in 1521 with Magellan, who many of us learned in U.S. history as an explorer. But when the Spaniards came to Guam, there's very few record evidence of prostitution at that time, but there is little documentation to say that there was prostitution amongst the Chamorros as well as what was happening by the colonizers. So there you will see a lot of Spanish influence weaved throughout the Chamorro culture, through Guam's culture today, but few records exist, as I was mentioning. But with regards to the Spaniards, there was also the United States and Japan. And the reason why the U.S. got so involved with Guam was due to the Spanish-American War. So we talk about the U.S.'s big point was that they wanted to get rid of slavery, that they were against slavery. And at the time, as you can see in early records with the Spaniards, that was something that they were partaking in, was slave trade. So I'm going to fast forward quickly to Guam being attacked. Now I noted here that is the day after Pearl Harbor, but that was actually due to the time zone difference. So it was only about 5.5 hours after the attack of Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, which many of us know as it's taught in U.S. history, but many don't realize that Guam was actually attacked just hours later. And as a result of that, this is actually a picture of my grandmother here, who was only 16 years old when the attack happened. And I noted here that there are 5 known comfort houses in Guam that we have a record of, and that those comfort houses were established by the Japanese at the time, established by the government as a way for the Japanese soldiers to be able to go to those establishments. But as what we knew and called as comfort women then, commonly known now as modern day slavery, sexual slavery. So I put my grandmother here because at the time my great grandparents had a ranch, and the Japanese soldiers would often frequent there for food, and so my great grandmother would cover my 6-year-old grandmother with chicken manure to just make her look undesirable and sickly, so that to avoid being taken into one of these comfort houses. So noting the impact on the indigenous Chamorros, as with any colonized people, the external powers can leave their mark. And with that, it greatly impacted the Chamorro people and the Chamorro culture. Chamorro people, especially being able to have a voice there. And I know Cynthia is going to touch a little bit on the powers that be and where Guam is today. Next slide, please. So it noted on Guam law, Human Trafficking Criminal Exploitation Act of 2009. I really wanted to highlight here that it's the year 2009 here, right? So that wasn't that long ago, even within my lifetime, that we have this, the Human Trafficking Criminal Exploitation Act. So it's the 9 Guam Code and trafficking in persons. And as you can see there, very similar to it just shortly after the Trafficking Victims Protection Act. But again, anything in Guam as far as education awareness, it was significantly lacking prior to that. And before 2009, any of those cases that we might know today as a trafficking case was probably seen as an illegal immigration case instead, as commonly seen in other parts of the world as well. Next slide, please. So I do want to put in the Blue House Lounge case, as I noted that when I have so many folks, including the soldiers I've served with at the St. Mary Kate, when we try to look up anything on human trafficking in Guam, there's really not much, but they'll say the Blue House Lounge case. So Cynthia and I wanted to make sure we actually put Guam's first infamous sex trafficking case. It's not the first known or just the first recognized, but it really is the infamous one that folks that are off island tend to bring up when they talk about human trafficking. And that's not to say that there aren't other cases. Cynthia is going to go more in depth later on, but just wanted to highlight that this is the one that you all have probably heard of. And the trafficker was actually an elderly woman, Sangja Cha, who's in her 70s at the time of arrest. She was sentenced to life in prison and ended up dying while in prison. But one of the things I wanted to note here is that she is an elderly woman, and in Chamorro culture, our elders are seen with great respect, our manamku, and we very much look at them as the key decision makers of the family. We look up to them with much respect. So this was definitely something unseen. And the fact that she's also a woman, I think when we think about traffickers, we may think of men, maybe middle-aged men, but definitely not elderly women. And so it was something that when it hit the headlines, just really important to note that in debunking some of the myths about what traffickers may look like or those the particular persona. Also noting the victims from the island of Chuuk here. So the island of Chuuk, that's something I wanted to highlight as well, because the victims are not just from, you say, like from overseas, from Southeast Asia. They were from the island of Chuuk. So that is something important to note as well. Next slide, please. So I'm going to do quickly over the challenges. One of the things with the tourism, especially in the post-pandemic world, COVID-19 definitely impacted the island greatly, and we're still recovering from that. But tourism is the largest component of the economy, and Cynthia will go in depth a little bit later on there. And the military buildup continues to drive the demand for foreign construction workers through H-2B visas. So that's something that even the Guam Department of Labor is very conscientious of, and just the fact that we have to be aware of the potential challenges there. A third of Guam is owned and operated by the U.S. military. So that is, and the military buildup continues to happen with even the establishment of the new U.S. Marine Corps base, Camp Laws, that opened up recently. Poverty is also a factor. It impacts Guam with about 16.8% living below the poverty line. And this was conducted and excluded military households. So just a very significant percentage now, and not uncommon to see 2 or 3 generations of one family living in the same household. So at the next slide, please. And at this time, I'm going to pass it to the great one and only Cynthia Cabot. I don't know what I'd do without her, but she was heavily involved directly with this, and so I'm really happy to pass this off to her.
Thank you, Mary Kate.
Thank you so much, Mary Kate. And also then on that note, just wanted to say that given the mandate to establish the Human Trafficking Task Force, as cited in the law that Mary Kate made reference to and established in 2009. The task force actually only more recently included and involved the Guam Coalition. So yes, for the past few years, several years BC before COVID, were we involved. And through the Human Trafficking Task Force, we were able to, with the Bureau of Women's Affairs assistance, establish or raise awareness actually in our community. And so with their help, they were able to produce and publish in different languages as well our Stop the Evil social media campaign. So certainly we are involved, or we are affiliated with the Guam Guam Homeland Security Fusion Center, which has established a hotline available 24/7 in our islands. And we have several agencies also participating in that effort. Next slide, please. So just wanted to also point out as we move further into this, and that as we're looking at the impact of human trafficking on Guam, where is Guam in relation to the region? We are actually up there in the corner on the top left corner of the map that you see there. and this is the entire South Pacific region. We are the top quarter of this map that you see. More importantly, what we wanted to note here are the different flags that reign over the area. That also gives a lot of history to the colonization and the different large countries that populated the area and claimed the region too. But in one sense, though, we are many different and diverse Pacific Islander communities here. Next slide, please. And so with the region that we closely work with, as we use this map and superimpose it over the United States, this will give you a sense of the area that we cover. So Guam, again, is one small area, but all of Micronesia actually covers the entire area. So when we look at working within the region, we actually go across 5 different time zones. So if you can imagine the coordination and just the communication, for one thing, we speak different languages. Many of us do speak English, but then again, comprehension and understanding differs, especially, for example, in some of our cultures, the word rape is not known in that particular language. So then it is not a concept that is understood in those languages as well. When we talk about sex trafficking, it is oftentimes maybe not a concept that they understand. So then that brings us then back to our efforts then, which comes to the very basics, which is essentially raising awareness and providing education to let others become more aware of the situation that we're dealing with. Next slide. So when we talk about human trafficking, let's start first with Guam. My counterparts, though, with our law enforcement, our partners with law enforcement, will actually tell you that Guam essentially doesn't have any human trafficking cases. Why? We don't have the numbers to. But given the law, we don't have the numbers to be able to show that we have human trafficking victims. So this is just a snippet of the cases that our partners with the Homeland Security Investigations did provide us information on. As recent as May 2022, for example, of a fisherman from the Asian country who transited to Guam from the Federated States of Micronesia was actually appealed or referred to the U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services by the Office of the Attorney General, and they informed them that yes, he was indeed a trafficking victim, but of course we couldn't do anything because it was outside of their jurisdiction. In April 2022, prior to that, our local Guam Homeland Security Fusion Center received a report of a suspected sex trafficking victim posting on Tinder. And in that case, then, our Office of the Attorney General investigated, but then again sought assistance from HSI and the FBI. In February 2020, HSI investigated investigation, and for the most part, it was more on alien smuggling and harboring, where Taiwanese and Japanese nationals were illegally recruited to work as commercial aircraft pilots. So these are the cases that we see, and it's certainly not glaring at us as human trafficking cases. Next slide. Now, oftentimes, though, we do have many tourists. And what our law enforcement will say, well, many of these tourists come in to play and they are willing participants. But we're fortunate, though, that it is essentially Guam's visa waiver program that we were able to, our authorities were able to identify these as human trafficking cases, being that these tourists were forced to work in these establishments, forced to have sex with customers, as waitresses, as therapeutic massage employees. And the owners of these establishments were arrested for housing them, restricting their movement, and then, of course, transporting them and withholding their passports. So that was key then in our being able to identify these as human trafficking cases. Next slide. So now between 2007 and 2020, when we look at statistics or calls to the National Human Trafficking Hotline, 2016, we had 1 case of human trafficking from Guam to the hotline. But since since 2007, there were 30 calls, and of that, 18 cases and between 20 to 36 victims. We can say that for the most part, these were primarily labor trafficking victims as opposed to sex trafficking victims. Next slide. So again, this just all the more confirms what or validates rather, our law enforcement's premise on human trafficking on Guam. We really don't have any based on these statistics. 2015, 2 suspects, no convictions. 2018, we actually ranked last in the U.S. for number of active federal human trafficking cases, last for number of new cases, and the last for number of defendants convicted. Therefore, we have no trafficking cases, or we have no cases of human trafficking on island. In 2019, FBI arrested a Guam National Guard officer on a related charge for production of child pornography. And then again, we will say we have no human trafficking cases on Guam. But then, of course, realized then, I was fortunate to meet up with the director of the Office of Trafficking in Persons. And so she actually talked to me, and it's like, you know, we have many youth who do not recognize that even the mere transaction or an exchange of, say, cell phone for sex is or can be seen as a human trafficking. But when she spoke to our local youth service provider, it's like, no, we don't have any cases like that here. Well, perhaps we have no known cases. Perhaps we are not asking the right questions. Perhaps we do not know how to identify that. So then that becomes our challenge then with the Guam Coalition to be able to continue providing training, and that with Mary Kate's assistance, we have been trying, you know, to raise awareness, to provide additional training, to bring in resources, to continue to say, this is what human trafficking looks like. This is what's happening in our community. Service providers locally will anecdotally support and say, yes, it is here. But I think this is where we need to look out and reach out to you, everyone else, to say, please, we need your assistance so that we can also raise awareness locally, especially with our authorities, to be able to recognize and identify so that we can provide the services that's needed to these victims who are out there. Next slide. So I know, you know, Mary Kate did point out then our poor economy, poverty, and particularly drugs being the mainstay here for many of those in our community, unfortunately, as being some of the challenges that we do face. But many of the recommendations that we continue to look at is ways that we can certainly strengthen the support for victim services providers to support a better coordinated response. So we didn't want to leave this presentation saying, oh no, you know, we've got this big black hole that nothing's happening. We see all these issues here on our island, but certainly we are strong like our community, but we are certainly needing in resources to be able to strengthen our efforts to be able to do that. We actually have great partners with our law enforcement, not to say that they're turning their eyes or turning away from what's really happening. It's just a lack of resources, that they have minimal resources as far as manpower is. So what we are looking for and trying to seek how we can support them is increasing funding support for our task force partners as well. And so all around, you know, we're looking at building up our own island capacity to be able to address then the needs here on Guam. And I know this also speaks to the needs or related to Micronesia, where Guam is just one little island in this vast Pacific Ocean. We do here in, for example, in the Marshall Islands, we have human trafficking and sex trafficking, particularly with young children who are exposed to trafficking, especially when the fishing vessels come into town, tying into the taxi cabs that bring the children from the schools to the fishing vessels. So that's the stories we hear from Marshall Islands. And then two, from Pohnpei, Federated States of Micronesia. These are our neighbor islands. They are also just as impacted by it. And given that we are talking about lack of resources for Guam, what more for the region? So then in that light, one thing that was really great that happened with this COVID is that we were able to expand and provide resources through webinars such as this to be able to provide training to them as well. So we've been in our own way trying to reach out and pull resources to bring whatever we can to support them. Several years ago, we were contacted by the Institute of Migration in Pohnpei, Federated States of Micronesia, asking for assistance with, for example, a child psychologist, because they were trying to prosecute parents who had trafficked their own children. So of course, we didn't have the funding, but we had mileage. We sent one of my board members who happened to be a psychologist to go and try to see what kind of support we could give. She came back to Guam. Not only were these 4 children definitely victims of sex trafficking, but the house that they had established for other children, she reported to me, she goes, my gosh, all the children are victims also, not only of sex trafficking, but also of sexual assault. So one thing though is that we are optimistic because children are resilient. And so what we try to do is also provide additional resources where we can. So I don't want to say that, oh my gosh, there are all these bad things happening, but I think what happens too is that we pull our resources where we can. We pick up the phone, we get on Zoom, we do telehealth. We try to be able to use what resources. I've got extra miles to bring people out to where we can. And that's how we roll here in the islands. So just wanted to say, I know our time is up. There's much more we can share, but we figured that we want to thank you so much for at least providing for us the opportunity to share a bit of Guam and what's happening in the region as well. So thank you.
Thank you, Cynthia, and thank you, Mary Kate. Cynthia, you get to go to bed now, which is wonderful. And it's so important for us to know what's going on in that enormous time zone. There are 5 time zones. That's a real hard problem, but let's bring attention to it. I'll make sure to let somebody in Congress know that Guam needs help, that you need help out there, because that's so important. And this presentation was awesome, and thank you so much for joining in. And you're getting some applause here from some of our listeners. And these webinars can make a big difference in getting the message out about human trafficking. And I'm so glad you emphasized parents out of poverty, I assume, do end up selling their children into human trafficking. And
Yes.
It's a reality. We have to confront it. We have to do something about it. But at least we need to know about that it's happening in Guam and Micronesia, et cetera. So thank you so much, and enjoy going to sleep now. Thank you very much. There's a beautiful picture. You want to say goodbye to us? Thank you to us, Mary Kate? Oh, you may be muted. I'm sorry. Let me get rid of this.
Thank you so much, Judy and Bill and the entire Wolf Group team and UNC Pembroke. We're just very grateful to be included in this. And just please, as you continue moving on and finding solutions and making waves, please consider including us in the conversation. We'd love to collaborate and just see how you all are doing things and see if we can replicate it for the people of Guam and the region. Thank you.
And Mary Kate, you shared a link to the Guam Human Rights Initiative for everyone in the chat.
And the Guam Coalition, yes.
And the Guam
Yes.
Coalition. So please get on the chat if you want to grab the information. And thank you again so much. I really appreciate it. Thank you for your service, Mary Kate. God bless.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
And now we're going to move on to our absolutely wonderful co-host, our keynote, Lynette Grable, who is an active advocate for Indian country for over 10 years. I mean, she's got such a resume. Oh my goodness. She's part of the Hunkpapa, Lakota, as well as the Northern Arapaho tribes. She's the founder of one of the most important non-governmental organizations called Not Our Native Daughters, which focuses on the world and education of human trafficking and the missing, murdered Indigenous women and girls. She lives in Wyoming, where she serves on the Wyoming Governor's Task Force for missing and murdered Indigenous persons. which she proposed to the Wyoming governor, Gordon. Is his name Gordon? Is that how you pronounce it? Gordon, okay, to create and implement the Wyoming Human Trafficking Task Force. That's wonderful. She does such wonderful work, including she chaired the Arizona Commission of Indian Affairs at its governor's office for 2 years. She advocates for diversity and inclusion of Native Americans. She advocates for Indigenous preservation of land and water rights, a very important issue, child protection, cultural and traditional competency, which is one of the solutions to human trafficking within the Native American communities. She's also a big proponent of environmental justice and voting rights. She trained and consulted with the Department of Justice Amber Alert program. We just had an Amber Alert here last night. She's worked as a subject matter expert and tribal liaison for various research and documentary projects. And twice she has run for Congress. She was nominated for the position in the U.S. House of Representatives, the Democratic candidate, in 2020 and 2022. And she was the first Native American to run for federal office from the state of Wyoming. She cultivates leadership with Native youth, with this group, Indigenous Youth Voices, which aims to expose youth to conservation preservation efforts and outdoor recreational activities. She's dedicated to advancing democracy in Indian country. She has provided congressional testimony on Capitol Hill on the Tribal Heritage and Grizzly Bear Protection Act in 2019 and the Tribal Youth Suicide Prevention Act in 2016. Such notable work. Since 2010, her organization, Not Our Native Daughters, a Native American-led initiative which began as a training resource for tribes, social services, and law enforcement. Her organization has educated over 7,500 professionals, both in urban and tribal communities. Such an essential service. Her organization has partnered with law enforcement, FBI, BIA tribal police officers, and Homeland Security. And her organization played a key role legislatively for its work on Savannah's Act and the Not Invisible Act. And both of them, congratulations, Lynette, were signed into law in October of 2020 to combat missing and murdered Indigenous peoples and human trafficking on Indian lands. And she strives for growth of a future where Native Americans prevail in all the same areas as other ethnicities. And it's such an honor, and I thank you so much for agreeing to be our 2023 keynote, Lynette. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Judith, so much. Thank you so much for that honorable introduction. Nakase, nananana, nech, nakase nech, manini, washte. I greeted you in my traditional name. My traditional name is Morning Water. That name was given to me from my ceremonial elder, who was also a family member during our Sundance ceremony. And Morning Water was in essence to refresh our people. And so I come here hoping to refresh you, both in my traditional and cultural customs, but also in education and in the form of understanding who we are as Indigenous people. I like to be seen and known as a bridge maker. I wear many hats in the role of working with different collaborative partners, both on a government level, tribal level, and a state level. And my goal and my mission is, when I started my organization, Not Our Native Daughters, is to change the statistics that Native Americans face here in our country. And I'm going to be very outspoken in the statistics that we face as Indigenous people. But I want to kind of elaborate on my intent. My intent is not here to elicit any guilt, to make anybody feel shameful or bad. My intent is to deliver and hopefully paint a picture of what Indian country looks like and the things that we face. When I started, again, my nonprofit organization, I knew the statistics, what we were facing as Native Americans. There's 575 tribes in our nation. We all have different cultural, ceremonial beliefs and practices. And we are all different. We all have our own customs. We all have our own language. We all have our own way of life, especially our traditional and our ceremonial way of life. I loved hearing, the background, as we heard earlier this morning in this presentation, of the North Carolina background and their traditional aspects and how they got into and implemented inside the UNC Pembroke University. Those were all rich things that I've never known. So I was grateful for that. And the amazing work of our Indigenous neighbors in Guam. I was also honored to hear what is going on in Guam, and I definitely feel like as Indigenous people we need to unite a little bit more better, so that we can support one another. But this morning, I'm here to speak from my heart and hopefully implement some change and some enhancement to the work that you may all do in your collective and respective areas. Again, my name is Lynette Grable. My traditional name is Morning Water. I am both Hunkpapa Lakota from my father's side and Northern Arapaho from my mother's side, both from Standing Rock and Wind River Reservation. I stand before you, a full-blooded Native American woman, and the statistics that hang over my head as a full-blooded Native American woman is that I am the most stalked, raped, murdered, sexually assaulted out of all ethnicities in our country. Native American suffer domestic violence 50 times higher than the national average. As I mentioned, there is 575 tribes in our nation, in our country. And because we top the list in domestic violence and sexual assault cases nationwide, out of the 575 tribes, only 58 of those tribes have either a domestic violence shelter or safe house. We've heard before from other professionals and presenters, which is also the same for tribal communities and my Indigenous people, is that it's very hard to quantify human trafficking victims. It is a silent crime. Victims are often invisible. Victims and survivors have to come to a place to address the shame factor of being a victim, and their journey of becoming a victim and how did it even all happen. I've worked several years ago in direct services where I worked with sex trafficking victims, both underage and adults, both Native, Black, Hispanic, white. And human trafficking is a hideous crime that is embedded in our country, that is embedded in our urban settings, it is embedded in our rural settings, but it's also a common thing in criminal revenue throughout Indian country. And then let me say this, human trafficking is no new thing in our country. Human trafficking, the selling, the trading, and exploitation of Indigenous women, children, and people has been here since the colonial era. There has been research and data to verify and confirm that the new settlers from the first ships that have landed in this country, that Indigenous women and children were offered as a sign of dominance and innate impurity of the colonizers to new settlers to say, we have conquered these people. We established ground in this country. Do what you want with their women and their children. This is something we all have to grasp and understand. Again, human trafficking is not a new thing for our country. Human trafficking is not a new thing throughout Indian country, and human trafficking is definitely not a new thing throughout our nation and the societies that we have across our country here. But I'm here to elaborate what we face as Indigenous women and with our children and with our collective Indian country. Throughout Indian country, both on the East and West Coast, and as for us here in the Northern Plains region, which the Northern Plains region is the Dakotas, Montana, Nebraska, Wyoming, and Colorado, we still have a lot of work to do in the realm of human trafficking. I have worked in California and Arizona. I have great partners in the Washington State area. I have trained many tribal hotels and casinos across the nation as well, both on the East, West Coast, down in Seminole. I've been up to Mohawk, a lot of Western tribes as well, and of course, Northern Plains tribes. Because again, my organization was established to address the human trafficking victims of Native Americans, but also in correlation and the intersections of missing, murdered Indigenous women and girls. One of the things I say to all MMIW advocates, those who work in the MMIP realm, is that you cannot talk about MMIW or MMIP or MMIR without talking about human trafficking. Human trafficking is a huge stem on why we have an MMIW movement and an MMIW crisis. The MMIW movement was first established in the First Nations of Canada. It was a way to say that we are tired of our people and our women and our children going missing. And anytime any advocate says MMIW, which is missing murdered Indigenous women, or MMIP, missing murdered Indigenous persons, I mean, we talk about every victim, male, female, young, old, children, etc. So I just want to kind of elaborate on that as well. But it was established in Canada. In the lower 48 in the states here, we adapted that concept of missing murdered Indigenous women because, and it was first acknowledged as MMIW because if you compare Native American women that go missing, that are exploited, and that are murdered compared to Native American men who are missing, murdered, or exploited, our numbers are very much higher. The demographics there are significant. However, we talked about any victimization. We know that all victimization is important. All families who have to face this crime and have to deal with loss of loved ones. And I would also say the loss of justice and the loss of equality and the loss of not being inclusive when one of our own go missing. Whether it goes, I've seen cases of missing Indigenous persons, both from an urban setting and a rural or a tribal, and the common thread is the same. We don't get the attention that is needed. We don't get the equal respect that a non-Native family would perhaps receive. When a missing, there's been reports that's been done by the Indian Urban Health Institute, and also we've done one here in the state of Wyoming, a statewide missing murdered Indigenous persons research study. We found that when a Native American person goes missing, not only does law enforcement don't react the same, neither does media. And for the cases nationwide of Native American persons that have gone missing, even if they were even able to reach the level of local or state or national media attention, they weren't put in a good highlight. Either their substance abuse was mentioned, they mentioned that they derived from a foster care system. They would make statements that they were homeless or faced homelessness. We've seen a lot of cases of missing persons throughout the nation, and we looked at them and we examined them, and we noticed a common narrative that we are not put as the same, not only urgency of finding that missing person, but also the same highlight when mentioned in any type of local, state, or national attention. Not only that, we were never, it's the low percentage that missing person was even put in media or news outlets in a 48-hour time frame. A year and a half ago, a 14-year-old girl went missing out of the Wind River community. This young girl and her family and the people that knew and loved her, this case didn't even get local attention, didn't get state attention. But 6 months later, when Gabby Petito went missing in the Yellowstone National Park. And not to take anything away from the Petito case, because I think her case is a perfect example of what families should experience when their loved one has gone missing. And God bless the Petito family for their loss. But in comparison, I'm only drawing a contrast here. In the comparison of that case and a child's case from our community, only a few hundred miles away, this young girl didn't get any attention. She didn't get a Amber Alert. She didn't get local, state, or national attention. But the Petito case not only got statewide attention, she got national attention and she got global attention. I was contacted from people from Hong Kong, BBC, Australia, even Russia, wanted to know about not only the Gabba Petito case, but also understand the difference between when a Native American person or a person of color goes missing in comparison to a white person. And again, I say these things not to elicit any type of guilt, any type of shame. I'm only drawing out facts here. The facts is that when an Indigenous person is facing any victimization, let alone it be human trafficking, let alone it be human missing, whether it be murder cases or any type of victimization down the line, not only do we have lack of resources, lack of urgency, lack of people to come and try to huddle around, the family, the victim's family, overall, we just have down the line, we have a huge need. I stated before as I begin to speak, is that I have these statistics that hang over my head of being the most stalked, raped, murdered, sexually assaulted, and also I would add exploitation into that. And not only do we have these horrible and hideous statistics that hang over our head as Indigenous people, but I want to elaborate on the lack of justice. There's lack of jurisdictional issues throughout Indian country. If a non-native is on tribal land or reservation land and harms or does any type of felony crimes towards a children or women or any persons on the reservation, not only do BIA or tribal PT does not have jurisdiction to restrict or hold that non-native perpetrator in custody, but they're not able to convict or try a non-native perpetrator on Indian land. This is why the VAWA Act is so instrumental for Indian country. The VAWA Act gives tribes the legislative and the authority to hold anybody accountable who conflicts crime on reservation land. Now, there's some perpetrators out there, especially human traffickers or pimps and exploiters. They know this. So they purposely come on tribal land and exploit, groom, molest, or assault our women and children and persons. They do this purposely because they know we don't have any type of lawful jurisdiction to not only go after them, but also to hold them and detain them. One thing they're able to do is call outside law enforcement, whether it be FBI, Homeland Security, or border law enforcement, which sometimes is a sheriff or border town law enforcement. They can contact them and then they can bring them on board. And most often, in most cases, we don't see those kind of cases go any further. I would say, especially for us here in the Northern Plains region, we still battle discrimination. We still battle a lot of inequality because of the lack of collaboration across law enforcement entities, but also just lack of collaboration from tribes to state to county levels. There's so many bridges that we still have to create, spaces that we still have to create for Native American professionals and Native American subject matter experts to help build those bridges. Sometimes I think we get stuck on the small stuff that prohibits us from moving forward in these areas. But we are still, fighting to have a seat at the table when it comes to any array of issues. One of the things I always say is that anywhere in the world where you find poverty and anywhere in the world where you find extreme poverty, you will find the selling of human beings. That is no different for your neighbors in Indian country. And just like across our society and across our nation, we have a lack of safe houses. We have a lack of survivor and victimization resources, but it's so much more detrimental for country advocates, those who work with victims, those who work with those who need the resources. Most often in tribal communities, we have to send our victims out of state to receive any type of resources. Now, if you were a victim or your child was a victim, and you come to a place of realizing that you're a victim, and then they say, well, in order for you to get help, we have to send you a state away. What do you think that does for victims? What do you think the rehabilitation and the survival rate of that victim in order to get on a good road of healing? That is, it's anybody who works with victims understands it is a hard road working with victims, especially in the form of rehabilitation and trauma-informed care resources and trauma-informed care healing. All of these elements are step-by-steps for victimizations of any kind, whether it's domestic violence, sexual assault, or human trafficking. However, we don't have those types of resources in Indian country. And I understand that even throughout our nation, we have lack of resources just in in our society as a whole. I was familiar with a case, a 16-year-old girl from my community. And I loved what was said earlier when the portion of the Guam presentation was stated, that sometimes our children don't even understand what human trafficking and sex trafficking is. I had one time as a victim advocate, I was contacted by BIA law enforcement who had a 16-year-old girl that owed some drug dealers some money. And because she wasn't able to pay them back, she had to work the hotel and casino to pay them back. When she wasn't working for these pimps and traffickers and drug dealers, they chained her up and kept her underneath the house. And when she was interviewed with law enforcement and myself, and when we asked her, why did you remain chained up, asking her all of these questions, she thought it was okay because she owed these drug dealers money. There was another case out of Sandy Rock back in 2014 where a mother was soliciting her 6-year-old daughter at the local gas station there just to get a 12-pack of beer. So when we talk about sex trafficking and child sex trafficking, we have to talk about all of the elements of exploitation. It's not like the movies as we see. It's not just like as someone being kidnapped and being forced. Yes, that is a form of human trafficking, but most often our youth are groomed, coerced, tricked. I've seen cases of Native youth for over a year's time being groomed by traffickers and pimps who send them money and send them phones and send them shoes before even meeting their traffickers and pimp. And this is how Native American youth are being abstracted off of the reservation. And also, please, Judith, interrupt me anytime. I know I can go on and on and on. I picture myself when I present the sun going up and down behind me. So feel free to let me know when my time is up, because I can go on and on and on, but thank you.
We have a few more minutes.
Okay. So I do want to kind of close with some of the needs of Indian country. We need more training. How do we expand social change? How do we create change? Well, we start by training. We start by speaking those truths. We start by educating those people who work into the community. This is why I'm so passionate about training tribal hotels and casinos and the hotel industry. Anybody who works on this topic of human trafficking will tell you that the hotel and hospitality industry is the main vein for human trafficking victims, especially child sex trafficking victims. And that includes tribal hotel in the hospitality industry. Another thing is that we understand is that we start to educate our children. I also train, youth and high schoolers on cyber safety. What does it look like when we talk to a human trafficker or a Romeo pimp or online boyfriend, the dangers of what that can look like. Because I could tell you a good percentage of Native American youth that are extracted off of the reservation is through social media, is through meeting somebody online. We have to start talking about these things. And I always say this, we must reveal if we're going to heal. And revealing is speaking to the truth, speaking to the facts, and speaking of cases, especially cases that come out of that tribal community, is also so very important. I also want to say that in all tribes, not only all tribes, but all tribal hotels and casinos that are in the gaming industry and hotel industry, which that's the work that I do. I train the hospitality and tribal hotel gaming industry. I believe all of them should receive training, the staff, the executives, everyone down the line, because again, none of us are going to be able to create that change and be the eyes and feet, on the ground if we don't understand what we're looking for. This is why it's so substantial to get this type of education and training. I'm on a mission to change the demographics and statistics for Native Americans. But one thing I always say is that we will be a fool to think that we can do this alone. Not only do I need my fellow advocates, Indigenous advocates, Native American subject matter experts to, kind of help elevate this fight, but I also need, the government sector. I need the state professionals. I need everyone on board to help to create this change, to address these issues, create partnerships. One thing I always say when I speak is, especially if you're looking to partner or help or aid Indian country, look at the tribes within your own state. Look in your own backyard. Because I can guarantee you, any type of subject, any type of need, there's going to be a need there. So I encourage all of you to reach out to your Indigenous neighbors within your state. I'm here to change, hopefully, at the end of my fight, change the statistics that hang over my head. Some other statistics is that Native American youth have the highest suicide rates. Some of the top 3, 4, I'm going to say 3 or 4 poorest counties in our country is occupied by reservation land. Native American women professionals make the lowest out of all women professionals in this nation. Native American men also, and I say Native American as a whole, but also statistically, Native American men have the least resources when it comes to mental health and recovery and rehabilitation. My name is Lynette Grable. I am both Hunkpapa Lakota and Northern Arapaho. I thank you for allowing me this time to speak to these issues. I hope I draw some parallel lines on what human trafficking looks like in Indian country, but also how that correlates with our missing, murdered Indigenous persons epidemic that we're facing. But I say this again, we need you all to come on board, help assist tribal communities, help enhance the educational piece of it, and help partner. Because again, we cannot create that change unless we come together. So again, I'm honored. Thank you for your time. And my organization is Not Our Native Daughters. God bless. Thank you.
Lynette, tell me the website for Not Our Native Daughters so I can provide it to everybody because this is really important.
NotOurNativeDaughters.org.
Got it. It'll be up on the chat in 1 second. And I just have one quick question for you. What are you doing within the tribes across the country to build up the Native American youth so they're not vulnerable? Because that's a big problem that we all have, that we don't know how to, we can't get our kids off social media, but we also don't know how to build up their value within themselves, their self-esteem, to avoid these traffickers online, which is, what they seek the vulnerable.
Yeah, absolutely. And yes, I mean, the vulnerabilities, of course, is targeting the poorest communities, Native American tribes being one of them. I was just at a high school last week, the high school here in Wind River. I was able to talk to some of the 11th and seniors in that school in a classroom setting. I think sometimes it's important that we come into their space so they're comfortable, they feel a little bit more comfortable sharing. But, you know, it's very important that we get in the schools. Sometimes it's very hard to do that. Years ago, I worked with a team of other human trafficking advocates, and we try to go to all the schools in our county, and we hit many roadblocks because anytime you say sex, it kind of creates an uproar for some people who are in the school district. But I will say this, that we embarked on a 2-year plan to educate high schoolers and middle schoolers. We were just trying to get into any school that we can. And we were able to bring cyber safety education and bring, I think the most impactful response that I had from the youth is when we brought cases of 14-year-old boys, 15-year-old girls. We were able to say those cases that came directly from their community or directly from their state. They were able to be kind of understand and be shocked, kind of shook a little bit because they see how close to home it is. And after a year after we embarked on this 2-year training to train all the schools and middle schoolers, we started to see cases in the news, human trafficking cases in the news, child sex trafficking cases that stemmed from teachers who got the training and was able to see when children were recruiting other children in their classroom. So, you know, one first step of creating any type of change is speaking to the issue. And so training our children is just as equally important as training our public servants, those who work in the community, those who have interactions with day-to-day people. They are also very important. But we were able to see a direct result when we educated our children on cyber safety and kind of speaking the language that they understood and knew.
That's so true. And Bill Wolf, who will be on at 11 o'clock, he talks about that peer-to-peer trafficking within our schools. So if we don't get in our schools and we don't get the message in there, which we know here in North Carolina, we're never going to end it. He called you a rock star. You and Jeannie called rock stars. You are the rock stars to end human trafficking. And I'm so honored that you were able to speak with us today, Lynette. Thank you so much.
I'm honored. Bless you. Thank you.
Bless you too. Okay, so we're moving on to the other rock star, Jeannie Hovland, who is a member of the Flandreau Santee Sioux from South Dakota. She's the vice chair of the director of Office of Regulation of what Lynette just referred to, which is in the casinos. She is the vice chair and director of the Office of Regulation of the National Indian Gaming Commission, and that oversees 524 gaming facilities, and I've been in them, as Jeannie knows, in New Mexico, which is associated with 248 tribes in 29 states. So it's a massive job. She began her 3-year term in 2021, being appointed by the Secretary of the Interior. She served as the Commissioner of the Administration for Native Americans, providing oversight of a $57 million budget to promote self-sufficiency for American Indians, Alaska Natives, Native Americans, and Pacific Islanders, all indigenous cultures and communities here in the United States. And that's so good that there's someone promoting the healthiness of these areas that have been so deprived for so long, as we heard from the women from Guam. She oversaw grants that support social and economic development, native language restoration, another key issue, and revitalization, and environmental regulatory enhancement. She created the Social and Economic Development Strategies for Growing Organizations program, which provides funding to strengthen the internal governance structures and build capacity for tribes and tribal organizations. She also served as Deputy Assistant Secretary for Native American Affairs at the Administration for Children and Families, a $58 billion operating division under the Department of Health and Human Services, where she provided expert and culturally appropriate advice to the Assistant Secretary of the Department of Health and Administration in formulating policies, positions, and strategies that affect Native Americans. She also chaired the Health and Human Services Secretary's Interdepartmental Council on Native American Affairs, called ICNAA. She served as advisor to the secretary and addressed issues of importance to tribal communities throughout all the partnerships with HHS. She helped bring national awareness to what Lynette just spoke about, missing and murdered Native Americans, through her role there and through her participation on a very important task force that most of you probably have not heard of, which is a presidential task force in the previous administration called Operation Lady Justice. And Bill Wolf, who was also on that panel, will be talking as well about Operation Lady Justice. Under her leadership, she brought a lot of attention to public health framework for action on missing and murdered Native Americans. She was a senior advisor, while the senior advisor to the Assistant Secretary for Indian Affairs of the Department of the Interior. She would provide strategic recommendations to the Assistant Secretary on issues related to things like land leases, so important, access to quality water, land into trust status, and energy and economic development issues. Her extensive knowledge and experience on Indian affairs include the many years she served in her own state of South Dakota and working for Senator John Thune for almost 13 years. She's a tribal affairs advisor. She dedicated most of her time to working with those communities, as she believes, and I think this is essential, in community-driven solutions. She was able to provide input on important legislation such as Tribal Law and Order Act and the Code Talkers Recognition Act of 2008. And Jeannie, thank you for so much, not only for speaking, but for also becoming a good friend. And we both love turquoise, so we have that in common. But thank you so much for speaking here, and I'll bring your PowerPoints up in a second.
Oh, thank you. And while you're
Please
doing,
begin.
can you hear me okay?
Perfectly.
Awesome. Well, first of all, I want to apologize for that long bio, and I'll make sure that we send you my very short bio next time. And I hope that by the end of this presentation, it is evident that no matter the titles, the positions I am in, those aren't important to me. What's important to me is that I serve our people and that I carry their voices in whatever position or title I'm blessed to have. So first of all, I want to open up in my language, the Haniwashte, good morning, Hafade, aloha, to our native Hawaiians and our Chamorro and Carolinians that joined us from afar. Chante Washtana Pe Chuzapi, Gini Havlanamachiapi, Isante Oyate Matan Shto. I greet you all with a good heart, and I extend a hearty virtual handshake to you all. I am Jeannie Hovland, a member of the Flandeau Santee Sioux tribe. We are located in South Dakota, my home state. In fact, I'm here today. I am the vice chair of the National Indian Gaming Commission. We are located in Washington, D.C., but I'm back here today on personal business, and I want to share a little bit about that more because it is part of our conversation on missing and murdered Indigenous persons and some of our vulnerable populations. I want to say Mchante Pidame Shto. From my heart, I want to thank you, Judith, UNC Pembroke, our speakers, my Hunkpapa Lakota sister who just shared about the important work and education taking place specific to human trafficking of our Indigenous persons, our missing and murdered relatives, and providing this platform for us to have a voice, which often we feel like we don't have that opportunity. So a special thank you to UNC Pembroke for giving us this opportunity and recognizing the uniqueness that we face as Indigenous communities and peoples. I was asked to share about my agency action and across the federal agency action taking place, largely due to our advocates, Lynette, and several others who have been at the grassroots of these issues and topics, advocating for our voices to be heard, legislation to pass, resources to come with them. There has been great action that has taken place as a result of families, communities, tribal leaderships, grassroots organizations, but there's a lot of work that needs to be done yet. So I want to just share a little bit about me personally. I was born and raised in South Dakota in a small town outside of my reservation. My mom is Oglala Lakota and Santee Sioux, and my father is Norwegian, so I'm half Norwegian also. I am enrolled at the Flandeau Santee Sioux tribe. Growing up in this town away from our tribal communities, I would hear sometimes about on the news if one of our persons, Indigenous persons, was missing or found deceased, when it happened in one of the cities like Rapid City or Sioux Falls, we might hear about it, but I'd hear stories growing up from my mother about people who had gone missing, our Indigenous people through the years. And then later when I started working for the senator, I had the opportunity to travel to our 9 tribal locations or tribal communities, nations, I should say, in South Dakota. We have 9 tribal nations, or the Lakota, Dakota, Nakota peoples. And it was then that my eyes were open, that there was a lot of instances, often on a regular basis, that our people were missing. There was no response. Families were calling for community members to come out by horseback, ATVs if they had them, bring in resources any way they can to try to help locate their family member. Community members' loved one being found deceased. Never really, oftentimes it was determined that it was by suicide or due to the elements, but a lot of suspicion that no, there's more to this, but not having the resources always to have the proper investigations on that. Not having the justice that Lynette talked about, not having the equity in having the response and the resources to find that justice, to find that closure. And that continues today. Again, I'm going to share some of the positive resources and action taken place, but this still is, we are still underrepresented in the statistics that we have, and that I'm going to share with. But I know for lack of time, I want to continue on. I'm going to have you bring up the next slide, if you could, please. I never want to assume that everybody understands what human trafficking is. And Lynette had a very good point that it is not, it can be like what we see in the movies where a stranger abducts somebody and takes them away. But what Lynette described is much more the reality that we see in our communities. But you have the actual definition, one of the definitions of what human trafficking is. And I want to share that human trafficking is one of the most severe forms of violence. And if you're in the investigation field, or if you're in the victim advocacy like Lynette is, you see the very evil, violent side of human trafficking. It's estimated, and again, these numbers are way up underrepresented because we rely on people, first of all, to self-report, and a lot of times they're afraid to, but it's estimated that 24.9 million people are currently trafficked, and it generates billions, not millions, billions of dollars in illegal profits, and it has become the 3rd largest criminal enterprise globally. So this is not just an issue in Indigenous communities in the United States, but globally. But we're going to talk about why it's so important to speak to this specifically to our Indigenous communities. But what is human trafficking? The definition is that human trafficking is a crime that involves the exploiting of a person for labor, services, or commercial sex. Sex trafficking is a commercial sex act that is induced by force, fraud, or coercion, and those are key words. With the exception when the person is under the age of 18, then if they are involved in a commercial sex act for an exchange of money or goods or other services, even if there is not force, fraud, or coercion, that is still sex trafficking when they're under the age of 18. Labor trafficking is a recruitment, harboring, transportation, provision, or obtaining of a person for labor services through the use, again, keywords, force, fraud, or coercion for the purpose of subjugation to involuntary servitude, peonage, debt bondage, or slavery. And I want to say, reiterate, I have heard from families and victims over the years that when we use the word prostitution, when we are actually talking about human trafficking, it is so re-victimizing. So that is one area that I believe that we are being educated on and trying to change that dialogue in not including our victims of human trafficking in with prostitution. I'm going to have you move to the next slide. Oh, thank you. You're on top of that.
Finally.
Right? So, like I said, this is a global issue, and Lynette helped point this out, as well as Mary and Cynthia earlier today. However, the statistics and the data that we do have shows that as American Indian, Alaska Natives and Pacific Islanders, Native Hawaiians, we have some unique challenges here. American Indians and Alaska Native people are at a disproportionate risk of experiencing violence, murder, or going missing, and they make up a significant portion of the missing and murdered cases. The United States Trafficking in Persons Report identifies American Indians and Alaska Natives as particularly vulnerable. And as Lynette said, Native women still experience more physical and sexual violence than any other racial or ethnic groups. These are statistics that we don't want to be leading on. And we know that, oops, I'm not quite to that slide yet, sorry. And I'll go ahead and feel free to prompt you there.
Thank you.
So thank you. And if I forget, remind me, but we know that the victims can be of any gender, any race, any socioeconomic background. But we also know, as Lynette said, that traffickers are going to target the most vulnerable members of society. And with the historical trauma that we continue to feel in our Native communities, in our Native populations, as well as this jurisdictional maze that we have, and each tribe is unique, as Lynette said, and each state has different laws. There's just a complexity of jurisdictional issues that makes us vulnerable, and perpetrators know that. They have no moral compass. It is all about the money for them, and they don't care at what expense. Next slide, please. So we've talked about vulnerable populations, and in my prior job, we worked with our Tribal Advisory Committee and through extensive consultation and our programs for the human services side as to the higher risk populations, which included all these, but not limited to runaway homelessness, children in the welfare system exposed to trauma, which is, many of our peoples and the historical trauma, our two-spirit LGBTQ, substance use, mental health, lawyer, socioeconomic, domestic violence victims, and of course, the high-risk populations. The reason we have human trafficking victims, because this is part of our missing and murdered Indigenous persons. And Lynette talked about, you can't have a conversation about our missing and murdered Indigenous persons if we're not also including human trafficking. So I want to share a few examples about this. It doesn't have to be one or the other. Children in the welfare system that includes children in the foster care system. And I want to talk about one specific operation which happened in 2019 with the Office on Trafficking in Persons, along with HHS Office of Investigations and local authorities in Kansas. They had an operation called Operation Hope, which stands for Helping Oppressed People Escape. And the purpose was to ensure the safety of foster children and in their homes, and to identify if there was any fraud, waste, or abuse occurring within the state administered foster care. So out of this operation, 18 missing Kansas foster children were identified, and a number of, in a specific community, and a number of children across the Kansas Department of Children and Families missing as of November 2019 was 56 verified. And so many of these children missing in the foster home could have been runaways, which then could make them homeless, which then they are exposed to additional trauma. There could be substance use. So do you see how it all can come together? And as Lynette said, we can't do this alone. We have to work together on this. They didn't, to my knowledge, break down the statistics of the race or culture of each of the children. But this has served as a model for the agency where they continue to monitor these efforts, and they have hired an anti-human trafficking manager to continue with ongoing missing and runaway youth investigations. So you can Google that to find out more. I want to talk about mental health issues. I came back here earlier this week. My son is an adult with autism, an Indigenous young man with autism who has become a wanderer. And we had worked on our wandering Indigenous persons, Alzheimer's, dementia, autism, and he was with a family in Minnesota recently, very cold there, left in the middle of the night because he has a magnet and he wanted to go look for things in pajama bottoms, slippers, a jacket, and was found 7.5 hours later, left at midnight, taken by ambulance to the emergency room. He is okay. He has some frostbite. He has some hypothermia. Didn't do anything criminal, just wanted to go look for what he could find on this magnet. But I've heard other stories where families have advocated to me too, where their missing loved one has never been found. Indigenous, not having those resources. So we want to make sure we remember all of our people who may be vulnerable, who may fall victim or become missing or murdered. And that's why these conversations are so important to be continuous, because first of all, when perpetrators realize that we're onto their strategies and their techniques, they're going to change it. So these trainings, these conversations need to be not just one time, they need to be at least annually. So thank you for letting me share that personal story with you. I want to have you go ahead and go on to the next topic. And I think Lynette really helped to answer this question, but I've been asked this in the past, you know, what does this topic have to do with gaming? And I have 3 answers to that as an Indigenous person and as a federal agency and our responsibility. But in my prior work as commissioner, I really wanted to work on economic development, especially coming from South Dakota, where our tribes have a lot of economic struggles, a lot of poverty. I wanted to see how can we get our tribal communities to have the dollar turnover and stay in their own communities. How can we strengthen our economies? So I went out and I said, but I won't do anything until I get tribal consultation and carry your voices, what you want me to focus on. And overwhelmingly, I was asked to focus on our missing and murdered Indigenous persons. And I said, absolutely, I'll be honored to do that. And how about economic development? I want to also focus on that. And one of our tribal leaders out of Washington State said, Jeannie, it's hard to have a strong economy when we have a hurting community. And that was when I realized I was thinking like a bureaucrat, and I was separating who we are in our work life and our careers and our jobs and who we are as Indigenous persons. And I knew that I had to approach this together. I couldn't do economic development separately and then work on missing, murdered Indigenous. We had to address this together and holistically. And that was an aha moment. So there's that, but also for our tribal gaming operations, some of them that are able to, they use their revenues to support programs that are so vital to prevention, to intervention, and for healing services for our families and victims that may go missing, that may be human trafficked, that may, as we go further up the stream to look at some of the familial trafficking that Lynette talked about, substance use, trauma unresolved. How do we go further up in prevention so that we can, our homes can be, you know, the safest place in the community? And so there's that portion to it, but also we do have some regulations that can help us as we look at this through the lens of the National Indian Gaming Commission. A little bit about us. There's so many federal agencies, and I'm sorry if I do any acronyms, but the Indian Gaming Regulatory Act was signed into law in 1988, and that's the law that established the National Indian Gaming Commission, which is where I work at. We are a federal agency within the Department of Interior, but we're an independent agency. We have the authority to regulate Class II gaming by issuing and enforcing gaming standards. And I should say Class II gaming on Indian lands specifically is what the law states. So we do have some authority through our regulations, but also through the Indian Gaming Regulatory Act. And that is the Environmental, Public Health, and Safety Regulations, which requires by law and by our regulations that tribes operate gaming facilities in a manner that adequately protects public health and safety. So in addition to the law, and our regulations in order for a tribe to have their gaming ordinance approved, which if you're not in the gaming field, in order to operate a tribal gaming facility, you must have an approved gaming ordinance signed by the chairman of my agency. And in order for them to get that approved, they must include this environmental public health and safety that they will operate their facility in that manner to protect the public health and safety. So that is where we get our authority from when it comes specifically to allegations of human trafficking activities. So a little bit more into this is what can we do if we know there are individuals involved in human trafficking in that gaming facility on Indian lands. So the chair has the authority to issue a notice of violation to any person for violations, not only for this provision, but any provisions of the Indian Gaming Regulatory Act. But if a gaming operations primary management official or key employee who works at one of those gaming operations are involved in human trafficking, then we would notify the tribe that it must suspend the employee's gaming license. You must have a gaming license to work there. And we have the power to notify, issue a notice of violation and ask that the tribe suspend their license. And then if these bad actors want to try to go on to another tribal gaming facility, we have the authority to object to the issuance of their gaming license. So we want to try to keep those bad actors from floating from one tribal gaming facility to another. So we do offer training that goes deeper into our regulations, but it's kind of more like regulators. So I'm going to just keep this a little bit higher level today. But people have asked, well, how do you know if that's happening? We have compliance officers in each of the regions across the United States that make regular visits to our gaming operations for compliance reviews. So that's one way to catch it. But also we could receive information from the gaming facility, from the tribe, from patrons, and we don't hear a lot. It is not required that gaming operations or tribes report it to us. But if we are aware of it and they are not being resolved, if it's not getting resolved, then we could intervene with some of the actions I shared. But once we are aware of evidence of a violation or any illegal activity, the Indian Gaming Regulatory Act instructs our agency to refer it to the appropriate law enforcement officials. So that's why working with our tribes, our tribal gaming operations and regulators, and our sister agencies who have the jurisdiction, the tribes and the agencies to do the investigations is so important. I'm going to have you move to the next slide, please. So I want to talk about some of the federal resources today. Prior to my arrival, our agency had already been working with our federal partners, with tribes, with non-government organizations and nonprofits to host training on human trafficking, indicators specific to the community, the general population. But however, in December of 2021, the White House National Action Plan to Combat Human Trafficking included our agency to work with the Bureau of Indian Affairs and the Department of Homeland Security and Treasury to provide outreach on the tribal hospitality industry. So we were thrilled to hear that we were named in that. Our jurisdiction is the casino, the gaming. So the Bureau of Indian Affairs and our tribes and Homeland Security, we really need their partnership. And we have met almost every month since then. And we have a culturally informed survivor or culturally appropriate survivor informed free online toolkit that we will be publishing in the coming weeks that will talk about the human trafficking indicators specific to tribal gaming, specific to tribal hospitality in our Indigenous communities, and how to respond appropriately and safely. In addition to that, our agency developed training and debuted it last year for training specific to indicators, human trafficking, red flags and indicators specific to the gaming industry. And we've been able to present that a handful of times to national law enforcement, tribal law enforcement, to our tribal gaming operations. And we of course, are federal agency, so there's no cost for if somebody wants to ask us to train or attend any of our training. So that is out there, and it will be continually changing as needed as the trends change, as the solutions change. But if we've done a lot of other great work, and can I have you, Judith, pull up the website? Do we have time? How am I doing for time, by the way?
I know you're fine. What website are we going to pull up?
Let's start with the NIGC. There are some excellent resources on here that if you go to nigc.gov, there's tabs, you hit commission, but Lynette's going to pull up the website. And then under the tab under commission, you will see where it says human trafficking. This is the resource page that you'll be able to see, the very top one there under National Indian Gaming Commission.
Okay, I've got to share this. Let me try to share this.
Thank you.
Share. Sorry, I'm just not real good at this. Here it is.
That's okay. While you're doing that, thank you. And you're doing great. You're really good at it. Our agency issued a bulletin in 2021 with a special emphasis on combating human trafficking. And if you want to learn about, I'm not going to have you go through it now, but if you click on a pamphlet, we have our several human trafficking agencies, nonprofit organizations combating human trafficking resources, who to contact, how to contact, and it's a living document, meaning as we receive more resources, we'll put it up there. If there's updates, we'll put it up there. We just refreshed it recently, but you can print out that pamphlet and it has several of excellent resources that are out there. If you go down a little bit, we have combating human trafficking through collaboration. This was a live virtual conversation that our agency did in January in honor of January's designation as National Human Trafficking Prevention and Awareness Month. We visited with Homeland Security Investigations Agent Doug Gilmer on the Operation Games Stop, which took place during the World Games in Alabama back in July. And this is the power. This was a story that where we talk about the power of collaboration. So in this, what had happened was this was a 4-year undercover operation that they put together in Alabama in preparation for the World Games. They had over, I think, thousands of volunteers locally trained on what to watch for human trafficking. Even some of the athletes competing at the World Games wanted that training and receive it, what to look for. I had been watching Agent Gilmer on LinkedIn through hashtags. I didn't know hashtags were meant for a purpose. I thought it was a trendy thing, you know, hashtag autism mom, hashtag crazy cat lady, hashtag human trafficking. It actually was bringing me these human trafficking articles and resources on LinkedIn. And that's how I started following Doug Gilmer, and he was following what our agency was doing. And so in the middle of the night, I got a message from him, and I never talked to him or met him before. And he said, we're in the middle of an operation. We have an Indigenous person. Are you able to help us? And this was during Operation Game Stop. So we connected, we talked, we were able to help get this victim back home to her community, which was about halfway across the country. She had been in a terrible labor trafficking transit organization that would take people to different big events along with several others. But I think so far, if you watch the investigation, several are still under investigation, so I can't share a lot of what little I know, but you can Google it and you can see where I think it was they recovered 7 missing children during this operation.
Wonderful.
Yeah, and assisted in multiple trafficking victims, both sex trafficking and labor trafficking, and there's been dozens of requests. It's ongoing, so I continue to watch the investigations, but that's the power, the good side power of social media. Use your hashtags, spread the information, send those resources, use it for good, where the human traffickers are using it for evil and for bad and to hurt people. So if you go down a little bit further on this, these won't show up, but it is on May 5th last year, our agency had a live virtual conversation. go to our website, watch these conversations. We share the resources at the end also, but this was with the Bureau of Indian Affairs Office of Justice Services, who've launched a wonderful website, which we're going to pull up here in a moment, as well as the Missing and Murdered Unit Chief Torbins, who's in charge of investigating our missing and murdered Indigenous persons, newly established department within the Bureau of Indian Affairs. And if you go down to the next slide, we did this a year ago in January in honor again of January's designation, but with Judge Richard Blake of the Hoopa Valley Tribe. This is age appropriate. Watch it first. If you want to educate your children about human trafficking lived experience, Judge Blake, with the permission of his daughter, shares about her horrific sex trafficking experience that she had. She was thankfully recovered and brought home, but that's just the beginning of the healing journey, which is a long process. But he talks more about their experience, the way that she was groomed, the way that she was lured, and the horrible things that not in detail, but that took place. So that is survivor informed. Watch that. I'm going to have you go back, if you don't mind, and talk about
The PowerPoint.
Yeah, I'm sorry. If we can go back to the PowerPoint, I want to show if you can bring up under the MMU website.
Up. Sorry.
Yep, that's it right there. So you mentioned the Operation Lady Justice while you're pulling that up. That has since sunsetted. It was a 3-year task force. It really put the federal agencies, Department of Health and Human Services, Department of Justice, Department of Interior, to come together with our tribes and to get a better understanding of missing and murdered Indigenous persons, and look at how we can gather data. There's a lot of barriers to that, so we're trying to work through those barriers. That's a session all in itself. And then once it's sunsetted, under President Biden, he's issued executive orders that have continued the work. It's so important. They're continuing the work, but also the Not Invisible Act was also signed into law in 2020, championed by Secretary Holland. And that really is been so instrumental. But that, under the commission that was established under the Not Invisible Act, this website has been created at the request of our tribes, who have been saying, we need a place to be able to report anonymously, to be able to know who's missing, what the updates are of cold cases of our missing relatives. So if you scroll down a little bit on that, Judith.
Sure. I'm just trying to save these links.
Oh, sure.
Further?
Yeah, a little bit further. You're going to see where it says, view missing and murdered cases, submit a tip or report for a missing murder case, email questions, learn about it. I mean, this is fantastic. And if you can go to view missing or murdered cases, the first tab under what would you like to do? There you go. This is so important.
Can you see it?
Yep, scroll down a little bit. And there's more pages to this, but here you can find, it's not all the cases, it's just what has been reported is in the federal database, and there are more. Look at these faces. Remember, I'll go back here regularly. I want them and their families to know they are not forgotten. And you go, there's, more pages. If they're in your community, please share on your social media. Makes me emotional every time I see it. So so many of our people aren't aware that, so many people in general are not aware that this resource is out there, and it's been asked for many years. It's there, it's available, and the link is on my PowerPoint. I always put BIA MMIP in it, and I'm able to go to it. And here, there's ways to report. Lynette talked a little bit about some of the other action that's taking place. This is the Not Invisible Act. that helped to create this website, but there is also the Savannah's Act that was also signed into law in 2020. And this law increases the U.S. government agency coordination to reduce violent crimes within tribal lands and against American Indian and Alaska Natives. And so again, it's just requiring agencies and jurisdictions to work with our tribes and to work outside of our silos to really address this. And then the Violence Against Women Act in March of 2022, it was reauthorized, and it expanded special jurisdiction, criminal jurisdiction to tribal courts to cover non-native perpetrators of sexual assault, child abuse, stalking, sex trafficking, and assaults on tribal enforcement officers on tribal lands. It expands what was there before, where we could have criminal jurisdiction over non-natives and domestic violence perpetrated on our native peoples on tribal lands. This extended this to also cover for perpetrators of sexual assault, child abuse, stalking, sex trafficking, and insulting tribal law enforcement. So it's a step in the right direction, but those are the only special jurisdictions that we have over non-natives on Indian lands. So there's more information on here. The high-risk populations is under the ACF, Missing and Murdered Native Americans. The public health framework, what it does is it provides the federal agency that would either have funding or resources or subject matter experts to drive community conversations on these high-risk populations. And so the human trafficking laws, it's important to know the laws that are out there, the federal law that is where we see a lot of the investigations that come under, and the task force is usually under, oops, sorry, I have a couple screens coming up here, I apologize. But that's under the Trafficking Victims Protection. It was enacted in 2000. And then it's important to know your state law. All states now have a statute on human trafficking, but on the federal level, there's no statute of limitations, but in some states, they do have a statute of limitation in place. So it's important to know your law. And it's really important to know if you're working in tribal communities, if they've adopted a tribal code, a kidnapping code, and the work that's taking place within the jurisdictions. And that's what I hear from a lot of our nonprofit and tribal human trafficking task force and organizations is know the federal, state, and tribal codes and laws.
Next.
Yep. I just wanted to share this feather alert that's taken place. A lot, not a lot, but some of our states are now passing missing and murdered Indigenous either task force or laws on the state level. And again, Lynette talked about this, but out in California, they now have a feather alert that is recognized, which is different than an amber alert or a silver alert. It's the feather alert. And you can read about this, but it's activated by law enforcement and or tribal authority, and they make the determination if the feather alert will be issued. And so it's like the amber alert, but it's specific now to an Indigenous person who goes missing. And so this is, innovative, it's new, it's in California, and we're glad to see that there is not only federal action, but there's also state action. And we know there's been action within our communities for years. And now we're finally getting the recognition and the collaboration from the other local authorities, state, local, federal. Next slide, please. What to do? I have these numbers in my cell phone.
Me too.
Pardon? Yeah.
I do too.
Oh, I'm sorry, go ahead, I'm sorry.
I do too.
You do, yep, great. If you suspect it, if you're in an urgent situation, you might be shaking, it's hard to get to your phone to try to Google and you're frazzled, it's good to have, I have it plugged in along with the Department of Homeland Security, their hotline also. That's how you report it. You always make sure that you are safe, never confront the suspected human trafficker or the victim if they're with them. Get to know in your community if there is a human trafficking coalition or task force or program that you can help support or volunteer at, and do what you're doing today. I commend you for what you're doing today. This is so important. And then finally is follow our agency. I think we have one more slide. I don't know if but we have, yes, LinkedIn, Twitter, Facebook. Follow us, sign up on our listserv, and see the actions that we're doing. We'll be planning something for Missing Murdered Indigenous Persons Day, which is always on May 5th. Wear red to remember our missing murdered Indigenous persons, and just be that voice. Be the voice for the victims that they never had. So thank you for this opportunity. I don't know if we have time for questions, but I'm honored to be here.
Thank you so much, Jeannie. And can you just know that your son will be in our prayers, our thoughts and prayers and everything, that he's safe and everything is okay with him. This was phenomenal information. You and Lynette truly are rock stars and give me a lot of confidence for the future. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Phenomenal. I'm going to post just real quickly the sites that Jeannie mentioned, so you have them. It'll be in the chat for everyone to see. Okay, now we're going to move on to my dear friend, Bill Wolf, who is the founder of Anti-Trafficking International. It used to be Just As Prevention, who has literally taught me everything I know about human trafficking. And I would call him Mr. Human Trafficking, but I have to add the word expert on there. Bill was a cop for many years. After graduating from the University of Virginia, he did 15 years in law enforcement, and he became a specialist in so many areas, missing and exploited children, gangs, etc. He has expertise in everything that I can think of, truly, including weapons of mass destruction. He's a FEMA certified ICS commander. He served on federal task force, which are combining like state and local with the federal government to work on human trafficking initiatives. So he was with the FBI, Homeland Security investigations, and the U.S. Marshal Service. He's done extensive legislative work, executive experience with lawmakers throughout our country. If it weren't for Bill Wolf and Chris Smith, Congressman Chris Smith, human trafficking would be 20 to 30 years behind, thanks to these two incredible men. He has testified in front of the Virginia legislature, the United States House of Representatives, and the Senate, as well as the Organization for Cooperation and Security in Europe, because human trafficking, as we've learned today, is truly a global issue, unbelievably involved in the entire world, in this global world that we're in. And in his official capacity, he was a special advisor to the White House on the Domestic Policy Council. He's worked in some of the toughest countries for human trafficking with these government leaders, including Mexico, which we hear about a lot because of the border, El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras, and the Netherlands. He has provided expert testimony as a court-certified expert on human trafficking. He started, when he left law enforcement, I was so proud of him, when he started an NGO called a non-governmental organization, originally called Just As Prevention, which has now become Anti-Trafficking International. And several of our students from UNC Pembroke have proudly served as volunteers at either Just Ask or Anti-Trafficking International. When in the last administration, he was the acting director and principal deputy director at the U.S. Department of Justice, its Office of Victims of Crime, one of the most important offices for any criminal justice person here, where he oversaw a $6.5 billion budget in federal grants. He was recruited to serve as a senior executive staff within the Department of Justice, and helped resolving issues with human trafficking programs, etc. And he was the human trafficking program director there. He has received numerous awards, but of course, probably the one that's closest to his heart is he received the Presidential Medal from the President of the United States for his work in human trafficking. But most importantly, he's the father of 6. He's a pilot. He has spoken at every one of my conferences. If it weren't for Bill, I wouldn't even be doing conferences. He's the best. He teaches like I do as an adjunct professor. He's at George Mason as well as Mount Aloysius. And I please welcome my dear and loyal friend. Like, I can't believe how blessed I am, Bill Wolf. Let me unmute you, Bill, wherever you are. I sent you a message to unmute, okay? Did you get it? There you go. I can hear you. Can't hear you. You need to unmute yourself too.
How about now?
Perfect. Nice to hear your
All
voice.
right. Yeah. So a very good afternoon or good morning to everyone. As Judy mentioned, human trafficking certainly is a global problem. And so I'm actually joining you today from Entebbe, Uganda, where I have been for the past week working on human trafficking in the East Africa region. So certainly very honored to be with you here today, and so thankful to Judy for all the incredible work that you have done to raise awareness, and in particular, this conference over the past several years has been incredibly enlightening. And I was so pleased when you called me several months ago and said that you wanted to focus on trafficking of Indigenous peoples, because it's such an incredibly important issue. And I think, as we've heard today from my colleagues, that it's something that is under resourced, it's not understood. There is not the focus or attention that's really put on this particular issue. So congratulations to you, Judy, for raising awareness on this incredibly important aspect of human trafficking. I wanted to say thank you to my colleagues that have joined today. I truly am not worthy to be speaking here on this platform. They are the true experts in what is happening in the Indigenous populations. But I did want to share with you a little bit of my perspective from working in the field as an investigator, but more importantly, working at the federal government level, and why it's so incredibly important that we raise awareness and provide the necessary resources to these communities that are being impacted. Human trafficking, as we know, is all about vulnerability. It's all about exploiting vulnerable populations. And in my opinion, one of the most vulnerable populations are those that are of Native American descent because of the lack of resources within those communities. You've heard that today. You've heard my colleagues share with you that there are just not the same resources that are available. I remember in my role as acting director at the Office for Victims of Crime within the Department of Justice, very early on, we were approached by a group that raised it to our attention that the majority of government funding, whether it's for human trafficking or, quite frankly, for any type of crime victim, is predominantly being focused in suburban areas, middle-class suburban areas. And that really shocked me, because I knew from my experiences, and I knew from speaking to subject matter experts, lived experience experts, that a lot of the trafficking is happening in communities of color. They're happening in vulnerable populations or vulnerable communities where there is a lack of resources. Those communities are the ones that need these resources the most. And so I was able to form a working group within the Office for Victims of Crime to explore this issue. And when the report came back, when the information came back on what was happening, it confirmed of what we were being told, and that is that the money is really funneling into suburban communities. And the reasoning was very shocking to me. The reason is because we, as the US government at the time, were not communicating the opportunities. We were not making the opportunities available. That was a huge failure on our part. And we set out to correct that. And the Indigenous populations certainly are no exception to that situation. We have got to invest more in these communities, because, as Jeannie has mentioned today, as Lynette has mentioned, as my colleagues from Guam have mentioned, we're just not investing those resources. I want to share with you, I know Cynthia cannot, from the collaboration, share some of this, but I certainly can. You know, this is a great example of why we're not, or how the lack of investment is really impacting some of these communities. A very warm congratulations to the Guam Office of the Attorney General, as well as the Guam Coalition, for receiving a federal grant to form a human trafficking task force. Federal resources should be used to invest in communities that don't have the resources. And Guam is certainly that. You heard from the coalition today about what is happening there and the very real need. But yet those funds that they were awarded have yet to be released because of a technicality that exists in the law that requires them to come up with a 25% match. Think about that. Because I'm terrible with math, let's assume the grant is for $1 million. That's $250,000 that they have to come up with in match money. When I was talking to my friend Cynthia, she said, I could go door to door and ask every resident of Guam for $1, and I still wouldn't be able to raise $250,000. We have to do better. We have to be able to invest the resources into these communities to be able to provide them with the ability to care for survivors of human trafficking. But also, as Judy pointed out, prevention is critical. We've got to get into the schools. We've got to get to our young people. In Uganda and the week before, I was in very rural parts of Kenya with an organization called One by One. One by One is looking to address these issues through education among the adolescent populations. And they're specifically addressing the issue of what is called period poverty, an issue where young girls, often from indigenous populations within countries in East Africa, that are neglected, that are not paid attention to. And these young girls don't have access to basic things like feminine hygiene products. So I was so honored to be able to join them as we met with, we trained, educated, and provided these feminine hygiene products to more than 1,200 girls over the course of the past 2 weeks. These are the types of initiatives, my friends, that we need to be investing in so that those communities, those populations that are in fact vulnerable do receive access to necessary services, whether it's prevention services through education, whether it's protection services through providing access to victim services. And then also, we heard Lynette talk a lot about the prosecution side, where she's worked with the BIA agents and other individuals that are trying to enforce the law, that are trying to hold offenders accountable. But the reality is that these populations, again, are very vulnerable. Things like the casinos, where I know Jeannie's working very hard through regulatory action to be able to train those individuals to identify. But people can freely go on to those reservations with the intent to exploit the populations that are there. And they're using tactics that we see in so many other communities across the country. Manipulation, coercion. They're lying to these individuals. They're promising them hopes of wealth or fame. They're promising them hopes of a better life, and they're luring them away. The indigenous people culture is so beautiful in so many different ways, and being able to work with some of those different populations to really experience their culture and to see how rich and how deep it really is. But see, traffickers exploit that. They go after that culture and they say, you know what, you're different, right? They paint it in a very negative light, and that they say, come with us so that you can be integrated or assimilated into the cultures, that you can be wealthy and famous, and all these other lies and ridiculousness. Quite honestly, it's a lack of disrespect to those communities, to their cultures, to their history. But they're leveraging that, just like traffickers do in all of these situations. They lie to their intended victims and manipulate them into lives of exploitation. Once they take these young girls and boys off of the reservations, out of their communities where they have certain protective factors, they take them out of those communities and then create control situations where they keep them from returning, manipulating them even more, or even threatening them. Or, as we know from the work of the Operation Lady Justice, and oftentimes killing them. There's lots of murder, and as Lynette was pointing out, sexual assault and other terrible things that are happening to these young people. So what is our call to action today? Well, I think that my hope is that you will take this information that you have learned from our colleagues today, that you really take it to heart and understand that we have to advocate. What is our role for those of us that are not part of some of these communities? And that is advocating for change and investment, making sure that they have access to the same resources that those of us that live in suburban areas have access to, making sure there is the investment, the knowledge in all three aspects of human trafficking. We talk about the 3 Ps, right? We talk about prevention, prosecution, and protection. I've worked with many law enforcement officers and investigators that have intersected with or who are agents and police officers in some of these communities. And consistently, they tell us they don't have the same resources as the rest of law enforcement has across the country. We've got to do better in investing in those communities, because honestly, it helps all of us. It helps us in eradicating human trafficking. It prevents it from coming into our communities and making them unsafe for everyone. So I hope all of you today will take something that you've learned, that you can share it with others as you go out to the community, that you can advocate for change, and that you can also advocate for culturally responsive resources that will really speak to these communities in a way that they will understand, in ways that it is effective. Judy mentioned I am the founder of Anti-Trafficking International, and in that role, we created prevention curriculum, but we created it in a way that could be customized for the community in which it was being delivered, understanding that we are a diverse country with many different cultures and populations. I'm so thankful to my colleagues at TWG Strategy. My colleague, John Freeman, who has been on this webinar today, has done an incredible amount of work as a retired law enforcement officer with DSS at the State Department. He's done incredible work around the globe, and I'm so honored to be able to work with him. Lynette, I was so thankful that you mentioned VAWA earlier. Another one of our team members, Maggie Ruffini, is a former Senate staffer who worked tirelessly, was the point staff person on the Senate side to get this last VAWA reauthorization through. I am surrounded by an incredible team of passionate individuals that are looking to eradicate human trafficking. And I can tell you that our organization, TWG Strategy, our nonprofit, the nonprofit that I founded, Anti-Trafficking International, stands with all of you, especially those in Indigenous communities, to be able to provide the resources and to absolutely advocate for what is right, so that you can protect your community and your people from those that are willing to exploit them simply for profit. Judy, thank you for having me here today. Thank you for all that you do. You are an incredible advocate. The field is so thankful to have you. And to my colleagues, thank you so much for coming and sharing this information with us today. You all are the true champions in the field. And so I'm extremely humbled and honored to call you not just my colleagues, but my friends. Thank you.
Oh, Bill, I'm so honored by your friendship. And I want to mention that Bill also has come down to North Carolina many times and come and trained our local police departments, our Board of Ed. You just, I mean, I don't know how you do it with 6 kids, except you're a pilot. You get around easily. But there may be questions and answers, but if you can't stay on, I understand it, Bill. But thank you so much. Thank you for these wonderful speakers today as well, because you even put me in touch with Raisa, who we're going to be hearing from in a minute. Thank you so much.
And I'm happy to stay on and answer any questions. Thank
Great.
you.
So now this is our local response about the intersection of human trafficking with the Native Americans. We're bringing on our Lumbee representatives, Nikki Locklear, who's the Director of Victim Services for the North Carolina Commission of Indian Affairs at the North Carolina Department of Administration. She's worked for 15 years in domestic violence advocacy, 10 years in direct services as an advocate and shelter director. She's had the opportunity to work with state and federally funded grants geared toward providing culturally congruent services to American Indians. Nikki has also worked on many projects in North Carolina to assist and inform victims of violence in the tribal communities. She serves on the board of the North Carolina Coalition Against Human Trafficking. And for the past 4 years, she has actually written the governor's Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women's Awareness Day proclamation. Her goal is to assist victims of interpersonal violence in North Carolina and in tribal communities, and in receiving culturally specific services that aid in supportive care. And then she works with, or Reza works for, Nikki, and she is a victims advocate for the North Carolina Commission of Indian Affairs at the North Carolina Department of Administration. She has 7 years experience serving her indigenous community, which is the Lumbee tribe here in North Carolina. She's been an advocate for various issues that impact indigenous communities all over the United States, including the missing and murdered indigenous people epidemic, and of course, human trafficking that she'll be talking about today. She serves on the coordinated community response team of our school, UNCP, as well as a board member for the NC Missing and Murdered and Exploited, excuse me, I always get this wrong, the MMIW and PAWS. She also is an advocate for using art and healing. And this is really important, that she not only addresses the problem, but she also strengthens the community to make it less vulnerable. That prevention piece that Bill Wolf just mentioned. Sharing how indigenous communities have used cultural art to maintain connection to tradition in a ribbon skirt workshop as part of the ARTIZEN 2021 conference in South Africa, Artisan Conference in South Africa with the Teaching Art Institute. And her goal is to create safe places for community members to not only discuss their trauma, but also to celebrate the achievements of one another on their healing journeys. And she also does healing circles. She kind of does it all with her boss, Nikki. And I'm so proud to welcome Nikki Locklear and Reza Jones. I have to unmute you, I believe. So I'm sending you the request.
Hey,
Okay.
can you hear me?
Perfect.
Good. Can I share my screen?
Yes,
Can you give me
please.
permission to share?
Oh, no, I don't know how to get permission.
Let me see.
Yeah, let me
You
see.
might not need to. Yeah, it says you have to make me a presenter.
Okay, let me see if I can do that. Okay. I'm passing the preventer privileges over to you, Nikki.
Okay.
Here it comes. Ray says can we hear you too?
Can you all hear
Yeah,
me?
I can hear you. Good. I just was double checking.
Okay, can you see?
Yep.
Yes,
Please go
Okay,
ahead.
great. Great. So I'm very excited and humbled to be here, first of all, in a room with the people that have already presented. Going last, of course, I knew that there would be so many things that they would cover and that we would want to cover as well. But I mean, I'm just really excited to be here and happy that Race is here as well to talk about the work that she does in the Lumbee community. So I work for the Department of Administration, the Commission of Indian Affairs, and we have a human trafficking program. We actually are one of the 7 agencies in the United States to have funding through the Office of Trafficking in Persons to be able to provide direct services to American Indian victims in tribal communities. And so these are some of the purposes of our program. What we are really supposed to do is place these advocates that are advocates who come from their tribal community. They are members of their tribal community. They live in their tribal community, and they are there to provide access to services to victims. And the whole point was really to have advocates in these communities who look like everyone else in the community. To be able to get people to trust and feel safer coming to us. So right now we have 4 counties for the largest tribes in North Carolina. We have an advocate in the Hallowasaponi community. We have an advocate in the Lumbee community, and that's Raisa, and you'll hear from her in just a few minutes. We have an advocate in the Saponi community and the Wakamasuwan community. And so, like I said, these advocates are there to provide direct services to any victims, and specifically, you know, in the tribal communities, to be able to provide that access to services. Because as we know, our tribal communities and most tribal communities are very rural communities and kind of far away from bigger cities where those access to services, you know, are available. And so that's what they do. Part of this program, we also educate service providers and law enforcement agencies, hospitals, and anyone in the tribal community, court personnel, on you know, issues surrounding our tribal communities and our tribal citizens, and how to provide these culturally, you know, sensitive and supportive services to our tribal communities, because it's really important that we provide culturally specific services, especially when we are in tribal communities. So a little bit of, you know, my background, as Judith kind of already told you, I worked in a shelter, you know, direct services with victims for a little over 10 years maybe. And it was a lot. It was a lot. I got kind of burnt out there towards the end and knew that there was a lot more that I wanted to do, kind of on the higher up level. And so, you know, writing grants and coming up with programming was really kind of my passion. And then, you know, I did a presentation for the Commission of Indian Affairs, and that just kind of, that was my aha moment. And that just, it kind of blew me out of the water, you know, of course, knowing what the statistics are and just kind of seeing what needed to be done in our communities, that I just couldn't really, you know, sit around and not necessarily be happy in what I was doing, knowing that there was so much more to be done for my own people. And so that's really kind of what led me to where I am today at the Commission of Indian Affairs. And I'm just really honored to be able to do this work there, and to have the women that work for me as well, providing the services that they provide in their communities, because they are just so compassionate and empathetic. And I'm just lucky to have all of them out there providing these services for our people. So let's see. I'm trying to go to the next slide. Okay. So some of the things that we've kind of done over the years, we've done a lot of outreach. And then, like I said, we do provide direct services to victims. Some of these services, of course, include housing referrals to safe housing, supportive counseling, of course, crisis intervention. We do safety plan and case management, really a lot of what your typical crisis agencies and DV agencies in your communities do. And so we provide all of that stuff, crisis counseling, employment advocacy, things like that. We also, you know, work very closely with our other programs at the Commission of Indian Affairs. So we also have a WIOA program that we work with if we have victims that come to us that need help with employment and housing. And we know that these are normally the top needs for victims, are employment and housing, especially safe housing. And so we have, you know, these programs at the Commission of Indian Affairs where we're able to collaborate with our other program directors to be able to provide emergency domestic violence referrals for our Section 8 program. And then, like I said, referrals to the WIOA program for work. We also, like I said, provide, you know, culturally sensitive and supportive services to victims in tribal communities, which we know is very important. And then we do a bunch of community education at schools and tribal events, local law enforcement, chambers of commerce, anyone who is interested in learning more about issues affecting our tribal communities, we are there and ready to discuss. And then we also are really, you know, proud and excited about our healing services program that we do have. Our advocates were trained by one of our elders in one of our tribal communities to be able to provide these healing circles for victims. And so they're going great. And that's, one of our, best services that we feel like we provide, especially, culturally, relevant service. We also do things like self-defense classes, mindfulness and meditation for victims. And then you'll see out here, there are, some examples of some flyers of some things that we have done and continue to do. Every year we have, an annual school supply giveaway in our tribes and our advocates. We have school supplies that we give away to local students. Let's see. So Race is going to talk now a little bit about kind of what she does in her community. As you know, our tribal communities are all different, but there are a lot of needs that are universal for us. And so that's really kind of what we focus on, kind of the universal needs. And so I'll let Raisa go on ahead and kind of talk about what she does with her program at the Lumbee tribe.
Thank you, Miss Nikki, and thank you to everyone that's here. As a proud enrolled member of the Lumbee Tribe of North Carolina and a double alumni of UNCP, I never saw myself actually speaking at a conference alongside these amazing people, and I really appreciate Miss Nikki bringing me into this space. She's a rock star who has been all over the country speaking on these issues, so it's an honor to be here at her side. And so just to talk about the work that I've been doing here in North Carolina, most of our Indigenous people are in state recognized tribes. So a lot of the issues that we have are very similar to those of our federally recognized relatives, but some of the approaches that we have to use might look a little bit different. And so here in my community, the Lumbee community, our advocacy relies heavily on collaboration with community partners. So our program is targeted to providing direct services and advocacy for all crime victims in our communities, but we do have a special focus on Indigenous people. As such, we are proponents of culturally specific services that allow Indigenous people to have access to healing modalities that are familiar and also work well with traditional lifeways to help rebuild our communities and strengthen our support systems. And one of, and as Miss Nikki said, we do have our healing circles here in our communities that I offer at least twice a month. And I work with community partners like the local Rape Crisis Center, the Lumbee Tribe of North Carolina, and also the Southeastern Family Violence Center to offer these healing circles, not just to crime victims, but also community members at large, so that everyone can have access to these services and talk about their healing journeys, because many times this is something that we don't feel safe discussing. There's a lot of stigma around being a crime victim, and many of our victims don't seek services for this reason, because there's a lot of victim shaming, victim blaming, and this leaves them feeling alienated in the community. Kind of building on my experiences in South Africa as a part of the Artisan Conference on using art for social transformation, I am working to incorporate art as a healing modality. So back in November for American Indian Heritage Month, I partnered with a local pine needle basket maker to do a workshop on this traditional art form here in Lumbee country. And we had a very positive response here in the community. And I want to increase access to healing modalities like that, so that people can understand that our traditional lifeways are so important in creating resiliency in our communities, so that we can have access to these culturally appropriate services, which helps to improve the trauma-informed care that's offered in communities. Because without that cultural aspect, you have the potential to re-victimize crime victims and create a situation where they don't feel comfortable reaching out for services, because in many cases the service providers don't look like them. So there's that feeling of alienation from the start, which is why I feel my work is so important to be able to help my community and also communities across North Carolina gain access to services, because many times our people suffer in silence, which creates so many issues. And to that effect, the chairman of the Lumbee Tribe of North Carolina wanted to establish an advisory committee on missing and murdered Indigenous people. To establish this community, I reached out to Lumbee experts in different fields who are likely to interact with crime victims who are at risk of becoming missing and murdered relatives, bringing together representatives of law enforcement, family violence and rape crisis service organizations, the Tribal Support Services Program, the Tribal Council, faith leaders, and other community advocates. The Missing and Murdered Indigenous People Advisory Committee has been working to identify risk factors for MMIP in our community, which we know often correlates to human trafficking, and also create a list of action items for the Lumbee Tribe of North Carolina to take alongside our community partners to help remedy these issues that plague our communities and help alleviate some of these risk factors. All of the crime victim advocates with the Commission of Indian Affairs Domestic Violence, Sexual Assault, and Human Trafficking Program rely on partnerships with our tribal leaders in order to provide access to services and also provide assistance in increasing cultural awareness and sensitivity among service providers that might not necessarily identify victims as Indigenous. So we know that this invisibility really impacts the ability of our people to be able to seek services and gain access in a way that's culturally meaningful. And we know that to be successful in providing services to tribal communities, it's really important that service providers respect the sovereignty of Indigenous nations and work to improve government-to-government relationships at all levels that impact Indigenous communities. Ms. Nikki, you can proceed to the next slide. So one of the things that Ms. Nikki and I like to discuss whenever we're talking about human trafficking is its intersection with missing and murdered Indigenous people, as our relatives here on this panel have already discussed. We know that there's a lot of intercorrelations with human trafficking in this issue, and we cannot stress enough how important it is for us to advocate for our relatives, given that there's so many instances of missing people at any given time. We have to understand that many of these people are at risk of human trafficking and all forms of violence. In 2022, there were 793 open cases of missing Indigenous people that were reported by the Department of Justice, 19 of whom were from North Carolina tribes, which we consider to be an extremely conservative estimate, considering that there's over 570 tribes across the nation. Although official counts of Indigenous human trafficking victims are scant, based on testimonies of missing persons who were found, it can be surmised that many of these were victims of human trafficking. And a lot of this occurs within the homes, which is something that I see here in my community. A lot of our people who end up as missing and murdered Indigenous relatives were victims of violence within their families by their intimate partners. And much of this goes unreported because of the shame and the stigma, and also the mistrust of officials in the community that have the power to bring about change. And we do see that there's a lot of resistance to awareness in certain fields because of a lack of understanding of the specific needs of Indigenous people, which means that we have to work even harder in some spaces just to make our voices heard, because we don't have a lot of that strong statistical evidence to back what we're saying. And so we try to work hard to bolster the record keeping that we are doing and increase our relationships with policymakers so that we can see change in our communities. Next slide, please. We've heard a lot about different forms of systemic oppression that our peoples do face. We know that colonial systems that were created to assimilate us into European lifestyles had long-lasting negative impacts on our communities. We're seeing that people are feeling hopeless. There's this general feeling in many of our communities that there's nothing we can do because we're poor. No one will listen to us. No one understands what is happening to us. And that's why these spaces like we're gathered in today are so important to help us reach out to our communities and increase awareness of what's going on here in our Indigenous communities, and to also bring to light some of the issues that we're facing that many outsiders don't understand. But one of the things that we see, as hard as we're fighting, we are seeing more and more engagement with local authoritative bodies who are coming to see that the issues that we're facing are not exclusive to just us, because we know that these risk factors for human trafficking and all forms of violence impact everybody, which makes it even more important for us all to work together to safeguard our communities and create resilience, so that we're not seeing so much access to economic opportunities and educational opportunities being blocked from marginalized communities. Next slide, please. Outside of Indigenous communities, we often struggle to advocate for ourselves because there aren't really strong support groups. Many people are just afraid to speak up because they fear retribution from non-Indigenous people and even from our own people. We're often fighting because a lot of people don't necessarily want you rocking the boat. They don't necessarily want you bringing all of this negative attention to the issues that are plaguing all of us, which again adds to the systemic oppression when you're bringing in all of this conversation to a very historically traumatized community. We find that there's a lot of poverty, violence, and illness at higher rates in our communities, which is compounded by the fact that most of our communities are in very rural areas that are already struggling with lack of access to resources. And even in places where
I'm sorry, can you hear me? Anybody hear me? We lost audio for some reason, and I don't know why. Raisa, try to unmute yourself. Raisa?
can everyone hear me?
Yes, now, go ahead.
Okay. As I was saying, due to the fact that most of our communities are in rural areas, our service organizations that we are able to provide are often understaffed and underfunded, which compounds with just all of these negative risk factors that we have to create an even more vulnerable situation for our community members. And the people who were tasked with helping us again, don't often identify us, especially if we have to seek services outside of our own community. And this creates just this cycle that continues to perpetuate all of this violence, all of the crime, and all of the negative feelings associated with trying to seek healing as an Indigenous person. Next slide, please. It is going to take all of us to dismantle systemic oppression, because again, this is not just an Indigenous issue. This is a human rights issue. This is an issue that has the chance to have positive ripple effects across all of our communities. So we have to understand why Indigenous people are susceptible to human trafficking and all forms of violence, because being able to solve these issues in one population creates access to resources for all members of that population that are suffering. And there's only around 25% of Indigenous people that now live within their historical communities here in the United States. And so those issues of invisibility and lack of access to resources are even more poignant, and it's even more important for us to work together to increase the amount of data that's being collected so that we can show just how urgent these issues are all across Indian country. Next slide, please.
Okay, so as you heard from Raisa and from everyone that kind of came before us, there are a lot of vulnerabilities that tribal communities have to not just trafficking but violence, period, and that really really all comes from somewhere else, from years and years ago, and that has to do with historical trauma, colonization, assimilation, forced relocation, boarding schools. There's just so much trauma, there in our tribal communities, and just kind of in us, it radiates from us. And that's why, there are so many the rates of violence are really disproportionate in Indian country. And of course, that leads to different cycles of abuse. And then you've got the poverty and lack of employment opportunities, the rates of substance abuse, and then of course the involvement in the child welfare system. So you think of all of this stuff and you take all of this into consideration, and then everything that Raisa said as well, it's kind of no wonder we're susceptible and vulnerable to so many things. And it's hard to say that we're vulnerable and susceptible to this stuff without also talking about how resilient we are as well. And although we have these vulnerabilities, we still have the ability to kind of keep on and carry on after all of these years. Another thing is, our geographic isolation from everyone else really factors in as well. Most tribal communities, like I said, are located in areas that are not necessarily the best areas. And if you look at reservations, around the country, we kind of get the land that is the hardest land to live on. And it's really unfortunate that happens to us, but that's the realness of it. And we are in these positions and in these places and on this land that we really have to figure out how to farm it, how to live. And so those are other reasons why we have vulnerabilities in our communities to violence, because of, like I said, geographic location, access to services. And that's really kind of what we're aiming to do with this program, is to make sure that there are access to services in these rural communities. And that is why we have our advocates placed at tribal communities, at tribal buildings, and not further away in the bigger cities where there are already services available, because we want to bring the services to the victims and not expect the victims to come to where the services are available. So, if we think about it, there, like I said, there's so many vulnerabilities and so many reasons why there are vulnerabilities. And, we talk about MMIW, and, it's kind of, I'm going to kind of touch on what Lynette said some as well. This is not to shame anyone, but this is really the truth of the matter. MMIW has really kind of caught fire now, and especially, in the last few years. And most non-native, people have heard of missing and murdered Indigenous people and the MMIW movement. But Native women, know that MMIW really has been a crisis since 1492, when Christopher Columbus got lost at sea, washed up on our shores, and thought it was a good idea to rape and kill Native women and kidnap them. And then he bragged about it in his journal entries. And to be honest, the violence really hasn't stopped since then. So you have a history of genocide where the U.S. Army specifically targeted Native women and natives as a means to take out a whole tribal nation. And an example of this is the Sand Creek Massacre. If you're not familiar with this, I would definitely look it up and read what happened there. So it's taking all of this stuff into consideration. It's no surprise today that we have a culture that promotes and accepts violence against Native women or Indians, period. And that's unfortunately the foundation of the United States. And it's not really going to change, until we have that conversation, until we have these types of conversations where everyone is at the table, and not just local, but federal. And it takes a lot of people outside of Indian country to help with this, and people that are willing to listen and to learn. So, and then you also add in, the legal complications, which don't help. And you got the Supreme Court pretty much saying, tribes, you don't have the jurisdiction to prosecute, non-natives that come onto your land and hurt your people. And so, it's no surprise that violent crimes have went up, and the majority of these crimes were committed by non-natives. And so, no wonder you have non-natives coming on to reservations and committing crimes when they want. So honestly, we could kind of talk about, what contributes to the violence and the vulnerabilities all day long, tribal communities. But, it really comes down to, we've got, a historical celebration and acceptance of violence against Indian country. And then you've got, from the legal aspect, it really perpetuates it. And then we've got racism and prejudice, not just on local levels, but federal levels as well. So there are a lot of obstacles here. But I say that to also say that we are still resilient people. We are still here. We are still fighting. We are still advocating for our people. And, that will never change. So, you consider, everything that we've talked about, the high rates of violence, abuse, incarceration, all of this stuff. And then you think about the prevalence of, violence in our communities and our families. And you now can kind of ask yourself, where does it come from? When did it start? What different forms does it take? Why are Indians so vulnerable? And, you should really be able to answer those questions now, because I think we've given a lot of answers, of really good answers of why our people are vulnerable to human trafficking. And like I said, violence, period. And so, anytime I'm doing these presentations, this is always my favorite part to talk about. Everything else is really heavy and sad and always kind of hard to get through. But this is kind of the light at the end of the tunnel, and how you can help, how you can help us, whether you're Native or you're non-Native, how advocates can help, how you can help just as a community member in your community. And the number one thing that you can do is vote. And people don't necessarily think about that, but that is the first thing that you can do. And that is what most people are doing. So, make sure that you are voting for, DAs who prosecute people who come after American Indian women. Make sure that you are showing up at the polls. When it comes to our people, we're not really visible at the polls, and we have got to get that. That's got to change. We have to make sure that we're out here voting for people that have our best interest at heart and our needs at heart, and know what it is that we need. So voting is just one of the number one and easiest things that you can do, especially since most people are doing that these days. And then, as an advocate for an agency, or just an advocate, homegrown advocate, contact, the tribes and the tribal agencies, and, discuss with them what it is that your agency provides, find out what it is that they need. Work with them and collaborate them, and then help do the work, because our tribal communities, most of them do not have the capacity to go after these larger grants, especially in North Carolina. These are state recognized tribes who, a lot of them are small tribes and work with volunteers. And like I said, just don't have the capacity to be able to go after these kinds of things. So make sure that you reach out to them and share the statistics that you have, and just see what it is that they need and how you can help them. Don't just assume of course, what they need. Develop and adapt your brochures, especially if you are in a tribal community, which we all are in a tribal community in North Carolina, and everywhere is a tribal community. And if you are an advocate or an organization in your community, adapt your brochures to what it is that you're trying to go after, who it is that you're trying to help. If you have a large population of American Indian victims that you're seeing, adapt and develop brochures that look like the people that you're providing the services for. Partner with your tribal communities and hold presentations and informational sessions, and collaborate with them once again on what it is that they need. Establish and participate in tribal agency collaboratives. Invite them to the table. They should be the table in the first place. But if they're not, invite them to the table. To join your task force and your advisory boards and any other collaboratives that you may have with other agencies, so that their voice can be out there. Establish protocols and safety plans and things like that, with the thought of American Indians in your community. Tailor that to that specific culture. And then, of course, it's collecting tribal specific data, which is something that you don't see a lot of, grants out there for, is data collection. But if you happen to get a grant like that or have funding for something like that, work with your local agencies to collect this data, because that is one of our number one things that is the hardest for us to be able to collect, is data, especially in North Carolina. And so collect this data and share it with the tribes. Work with them in collecting the data. Ask them how to go about collecting the data. And then, of course, providing letters of support and memorandums of understanding when tribal programs are applying for grants. Because like I said, these are smaller tribes who may not necessarily have the capacity for huge grants and large pots of money. But any way that you can help, like providing letters of support and MOUs, are that kind of stuff is invaluable. And I think that is pretty much all we have. And right here is just some of our local resources. if anyone has, any need for any more information, please reach out to these local resources as well. But I think I'm done. Raisa, if you have anything to add, please go ahead. I just wanted to say thank you, Judith, so much for thinking of us and bringing us to the space today. We are beyond grateful to be here and to talk about our programs and what it is that we're offering. And like I said, to just kind of hear the other experts and their points of view as well.
Well, this was really, truly amazing. Much, even 1,000 times more than I anticipated. The speakers have been awesome. Lynette has been clapping for you, Nikki and Raisa. I don't know if you've seen it, the little clap going up and down and all the initiatives you just mentioned. Does anyone have a question for any of the speaker? It's probably easier. I just sent you an unmute, Raisa. It's probably easier if you just chat it to me and I can add to speakers. But Lynette and Bill and Nikki and Raisa are still here. We lost Jeannie because, well, she's got the big personal issue that we mentioned. But if anybody has a question for the speaker, if you could raise your hand. It'd be easier if you just entered it in the chat so I can ask the question specifically. Because unmuting everybody is not a good idea. But if not, we'll just wait another minute. Lynette, is there anything you'd like to share? Are you unmuted? If there's anything you'd like to share after what you've heard.
Yeah, no, I just want to I'm honored to learn from other people who are doing the work, especially in other regions of the nation. I think it's important that we learn from one another and share our stories. I think it's also very important in the realm of human trafficking in Indian country and missing murdered Indigenous persons that, we have the opportunity to tell our stories, to educate the greater outcome or the greater good of educating others. Most often, especially in the human trafficking movement, we see others who are non-native who are expanding that education, and there's enough of us who are doing this work. There's enough of us who are educated, enough of us who have worked in the human trafficking survivors. There's enough of Native American subject matter experts. So it's very important when we talk about being, equality and inclusion, that we consider our Native American professionals and utilize them in the education and academia realm.
One thing I noticed that all you women have done today is, if anybody here is Native American or just somebody who's vulnerable, look at these women and what they're doing. They're incredible. They're incredible examples. They're people that you should imitate, get involved, be a part of ending this crime. I think for all the criminal justice professionals, you've got to know we can only do this with all of you. It can't just be the experts that we brought here today, the Bill Wolfs, Lynette, Jeannie, Nikki, Raisa, and the ladies from Guam, Mary Kate, and it just can't be us. It just can't be us doing the work. You can all work to solve it. But look at these great examples of women you can imitate and emulate and what they're doing. Get involved, especially if you're going into my field, criminal justice. We really need to have you out there knowing about human trafficking and how it impacts different communities, as we've seen here today. I don't see any questions, but boy, you're getting a lot of compliments, ladies. You're getting a ton of compliments. And there will be a recording, and there'll also be CEUs for social workers. There'll be a recording when I send it out. I'll send out the CEU certificates. And Lynette, thank you for keynoting. Bill, thank you for all your recommendations. Race and Nikki, I'm so glad locally we have such a great team. I'd like to thank my dean. She's incredible. She gets me through the technology and everything. Dean Dr. Ashley Allen, Courtney Powers, her assistant, Dr. Locklear. That history of Pembroke makes, I hope you all appreciate it, that we brought out the history of Pembroke as a historically Native American college. I'm so proud of him. My chair, who puts up with me every year doing this, Dr. Porter Willis, his unbelievable assistant, administrative assistant, Shannon Maynor, to all our speakers, to James Lewis and Marquita, who keep me going with the technology. And of course, I have to thank Bill Wolf because he gave me all these great suggestions. He put this all together as he always does. But thank you so much. And let's remember to keep Jeannie's son in our thoughts and prayers, because that's a tough one that she's going through. But I can't thank you all enough. I can't even, I want to cry. I'm so happy. It was such a great conference. And thank you, Lynette, especially to you. You really opened our eyes to so much nationally that we have. There's so much work to be done, and we're willing to do it with you. Oh, you got muted again. I'm sorry. Lynette.
Thank you, Judith. You've just been amazingly supportive throughout this whole ordeal prior to the webinar and until today. Thank you for my presenters. Thank you for your strong voices and your willingness to share your voice and your stories and your expertise. I'm honored to be here with all of you. Thank you.
We were so honored to have you, and we went all the way from Uganda out to Guam. We've covered many more time zones than I ever thought. Thank you all. Take care. You'll get the recording in a few days, okay? Thank you. Thank you. The compliments are keep coming in the chat. They're still there. Thank you, ladies.
Thank you for the support, everyone.
Thank you, Raisa. You all look so beautiful too, by the way.
Thank you, Miss Judy.
Take care.